recovery, we've got to address all of the issues that are facing women. We are in a crisis for women and people of color in this country.
Now, the last time you and I spoke, it was about your book, The Moment of Lift, How Empowering Women Changes the World. That came out 2 years ago. On the heels of Me Too, there was a lot of hope. Have you seen that play out, or have you seen progress develop?
We've seen, I would definitely say that was a moment of optimism for me. And I would say now I think women are in a moment of crisis. So we've seen a lot of work derailed. We've seen women women in the last 30 years were coming out of poverty as a globe. And now we're seeing a huge setback in that arena. We're seeing setback in the labor force. The number of women who've stepped back from the labor force in the United States, 2/3 of the jobs lost in South Africa were women's jobs. So I think we're in a moment of crisis. But then on the flip side, I see these female leaders, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, Prime Minister Merkel, how well their countries are doing. Or I see these self-help groups in India that immediately mobilized and got messages about COVID out to millions of people in northern India. So I see the hope on the other side, but there's a lot of work to do.
I was planning to ask you about New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern and Germany's Angela Merkel. Do you think it's a coincidence that both of these leaders, who seem to have handled the pandemic better than any other leader around the world, do you think it's a coincidence that they're both women?
Not at all. I spoke with both of them pretty early in the crisis, but where New Zealand had just taken care of COVID in their country the first time, and Prime Minister Merkel had it under control in Germany. And I was also speaking to male leaders at the same time. But what I noticed when I talked to these two women a month apart is that Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern was thinking about all the island nations around her and that they were struggling. And so, yes, they had it under control in New Zealand, but she was thinking about the whole ecosystem around them and everybody else. Prime Minister Merkel, when I talked with her about, wow, you all are doing an amazing job, she wanted to talk about the marginalized communities in Germany they weren't yet reaching. And she wanted to talk about how they were taking patients in from other countries into their emergency room and ICU. So they're thinking about everybody else. And I see that sometimes in enlightened male leaders, but I think for the women, it just comes really naturally.
So how did that compare with your early conversations with the Trump administration as you were working with the US government to deploy your own resources?
Well, I think, there were certain people who are still in place who are absolutely incredible. Tony Fauci from the get-go, just an amazing leader. Francis Collins at the NIH. But, to talk to an administration who doesn't believe in science and basically wants to put their blinders on in terms of what the response needs to be in the United States, it was incredibly frustrating. And I am very happy to see a new administration who's not only taking this seriously, but taking very bold and concrete actions. That's what we should expect as Americans.
So how have your conversations with the Biden administration been so far, now a few months into it? What are you happy about in terms of what you're seeing? What needs work?
I'm seeing the Biden administration absolutely listen to the science, listen to the scientists, believe in the data. You're seeing them re-empower CDC. CDC just came out with great guidelines for people who have been vaccinated. So they've taken these institutions that were strong and robust, and they're empowering them again. I was incredibly pleased to see the latest stimulus package pushed through and funded so swiftly for Americans. That's exactly the kind of action we need as Americans.
The Biden administration just signed an executive order on gender equity on International Women's Day. What are some other concrete, tangible things you would like to see from the White House that would really make a difference for women in this country?
Well, I'd love to see an innovation fund. In previous administrations, there have been these innovation funds that make sure we get new innovations, for instance, in climate change or in other sectors. I would love to see an innovation fund focused on childcare. We have a caregiving crisis, not just childcare, elderly care too. We have a caregiving crisis, and yet there are great ideas out there, solutions for how you match markets, you match caregivers, affordable, good, high quality caregivers with parents. or you match grandparents with college kids so they can get their prescriptions. Those kinds of ideas need to be funded and come forward so that we can come up with new innovations in society.
When it comes to women and how much they backslid in the pandemic, do you think we could see a lost generation of women as a result of the trauma that they have experienced in the last year?
I think we could, but I don't think it's a necessary or a necessity. And I think, one of the things the Biden administration is talking about is paid family medical leave. We are the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't have it. And it's far from time we had it. And so I think we can take this crisis that's happened to women. Women are in crisis at home. They are carrying a lot. But we can use it to say, we're not just going to propel these women and help them back in the workforce. We're going to change the structure of the workforce for the next 30 years so we make it possible for moms and dads or like-minded partners to work. We're going to look at this as a forward-looking workforce, not a 1950s workforce where our dads went to work and our moms stayed home.
Well, and speaking of how the workforce will change going forward, I believe we're going to be in a more hybrid environment in the future, more flexible work, more people working from home. And I wonder if we're going to continue to see women in this difficult situation. Like, how do you see the new normal for women being different than the new normal for men? And what should we be concerned about and preparing for?
I think we need to make sure that women aren't expected to now continue to care for the children and the elderly and keep their job going. They're in a crisis that can't continue. The toll on women is enormous. So I think we need to say, how are we going to make sure we support women? How do we bring them back into the workforce? How do we reskill them if they want to change jobs? How do we make sure they have access to good childcare, potentially even good universal preschool? And then how do we make sure as well that we're supporting them, that if they have a sick family member, there's not just maternity leave or sick maternity days, but there's paid family medical leave. So even the dad leaves the office to take the child to the pediatrician when the child gets sick or takes care of the elderly grandparents.
I wonder if you think we're going to see the most meaningful change in the world coming from philanthropy.
Ultimately, it's always up to government to scale up innovations to create this change.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad, that we are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
When you wrote your book, you shared that you quit your own job at Microsoft because you assumed that you should stay home and take care of the kids. And then at a certain point, you decided you wanted to go back to work. What were your motivations there? And, how would you encourage other women to summon their motivations?
I would say, you have to look at what you're doing and what your expectations are. And I think for me, it was always when I would hit these frustration points of, my gosh, why am I doing all of this and my husband is not, and so I think we all have to look at our homes and say, who's doing what? And how do we redistribute that workload? And we have to have those honest conversations with one another. One of the stories I tell in my book, when I did want to go back to work, was, Bill and I knew where we wanted to put our children in school, but it was well far away from our house. And I thought, hey, we could wait maybe till 4th or 5th grade. And he was adamant. He wanted them to start at preschool. And I just said, look, I can't be on the road driving all the time. I see my road ahead and my life ahead of the minivan. And so he finally offered to drive the kids to school. And it not only changed the norm in our family, and he got that time with the kids, but when he went into the classroom, other moms expected their husbands then to drive because they said, see, Microsoft is driving his kids to school, so can you. And it's those conversations at home when we see what's right there, we have awareness, we have the difficult conversation, that we remodel norms inadvertently actually in society.
I'm curious about female leadership and if you think female leadership could suffer as a result of the pandemic. We need more women leaders to help continue to pave the way. But if they're running companies and households, does that mean we won't see as many women advance into leadership roles as we might have seen had the pandemic not happened?
Potentially, and that's why we need to make sure we support them. I mean, there are fewer female CEOs of Fortune 500 companies today than when we started into this pandemic. And, you can look at those on a case-by-case basis, but you also just have to look at what's coming up behind women. What's coming up behind that CEO? How many women and people of color are at all levels of leadership? That's where I worry the most. And so without good supports, without flexible work hours, without paid family medical leave, without a network of support around them, yes, you will see women drop out of these middle manager positions just as they're climbing the ladder. And so when we go to then promote somebody into the C-suite, there just aren't as many women. The harassment in the workforce. Women change their job. 80% of women say they've been harassed in the workforce, and when they are, they leave their job within a 2-year rate. So they switch careers and they're not climbing the same ladder. That's a barrier we've got to look at.
Now, we do have our first woman vice president, who is also a woman of color, and I don't know if it's a sign that norms are changing, but my sons don't understand why there has never been a woman president. To them, it seems obvious, and I wonder, do you think it's time for a woman to lead this country?
Absolutely, it's time. And, and so there are many qualified women, but it's not very easy to climb the ladder in politics. So that's another place we need to support women at the local level, state level, federal level. We keep ticking up slightly in Congress in terms of the number of women in Congress, but guess what? We're still 60 years away from equality in Congress. And I don't think it's surprising that Kamala Harris came from the Senate. Those are great places to learn how to have the ultimate leadership role. But let's make sure women come up in politics so they're ready. And so there's a plethora of women we can choose from for the President of the United States.
What about children? After a year, for many kids at home, some of them don't even have access to a computer. How concerned are you about the digital divide and a lost years for our children? Boys and girls?
I'm quite concerned. So first of all, there are hundreds of millions of girls around the world who are out of the education system, and many of them won't actually go back. And here in the United States, I'm most worried about the low-income children because, as you say, they don't often have access to broadband or to internet, or a teacher who's got a great curriculum to all of a sudden have to switch and teach online. That was a hard switch for teachers. But it's also a really hard switch for students. And so teachers have to be retrained and reskilled in the moment. So yes, they've lost a year of schooling, but the learning losses could be even more substantial for low-income kids. And I'm quite concerned about that.
For those who have had access to technology, we've had devices introduced to our children much sooner than we ever wanted to. And for some parents, that is terrifying. Are you concerned about screen time and the longer term impact on a generation of kids?
Yes, I think we don't know what those impacts are. There is research that some of which has come out, some of which is ongoing. There are some positives, which is they can connect with friends, they're connecting online, they're finding meaningful opportunities sometimes online. But yes, I think we don't know what it means for a generation of kids to be behind that screen so often. And so I tell parents, just be sensible, make sure it gets out of their hands. We know it's not great for a parent to be on and spend 40 extra minutes sucked into social media at night. How can that be good for a kid? So, all those things that, we know are just good parenting. Get the phone out of the room at night, take the hard steps. It's just going to benefit your child.
Do you think that schools should reopen? I mean, if adults are going to be vaccinated by May, maybe end of summer, it could be another year before our children are vaccinated. Should schools reopen in the fall regardless?
I think schools will have to look in district by district, what are the rates of COVID in their area based on people who've been vaccinated. We don't know where we will be in the fall with variants. So, looking at the data today that we have, it sure looks like we can start to reopen more schools. But again, this thing has been very cyclical. So what it will look like in the fall, I'm not sure. Ask me on September 1st what I think about which districts maybe should or shouldn't be open. I sure hope they can be open again.
Now, in closing, Melinda, your foundation has now donated several billions of dollars to health, to science, to climate, to education. And I wonder if you think we're going to see the most meaningful change in the world coming from philanthropy, coming from wealthy people like yourself who can make certain things a priority rather than governments in the future. Is that how the world is going to change?
No, I don't think so. I think what we should expect is that philanthropy can also often take risks. They can try innovations that sometimes work and sometimes fail. They can look for new solutions. They can help us collect the data. But ultimately, it's always up to government to scale up these innovations to create this change. The vaccine for COVID is a perfect example. Those are pharmaceutical companies working with philanthropists and investors, but working with the government. Ultimately, it's billions of dollars from the government that will pull that vaccine through and purchase it for Americans and people in low-income countries. So it's always up to government, but I think philanthropy or private sector and civil society can always help lead the way.
All right, Melinda Gates, we'll continue to follow your work, and we're grateful for the work that you are doing. Thank you so much for joining us today here at Bloomberg. It's wonderful to have you.
Every Friday with 30 minutes dedicated to fixed income, I'm Jonathan Ferro. This is Bloomberg Real Yield.
We're early on in this year. I know we've already sort of penciled in 6 or 7% growth and a big fall in unemployment, but under outcome-based policy, we really want to see that.
I'm bullish on the rebound, but I know we have a long way to go before the job is complete.
There's no textbook for this. You don't want to be too preemptive, but I also don't want to be so reactive that we're late.
I think it's too early to talk about changing monetary policy while we're still in the pandemic tunnel.
I'm David Weston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
It has the makings of one of the tech world's greatest comebacks. Chinese internet old-timer Baidu has pulled itself back from the brink of near obscurity, and it's now on the cusp of re-emerging as one of the country's most influential companies after losing its lead to a string of hard-driving competitors. Bold bets on autonomous vehicles and AI chips are starting to come good. Its smart speakers and cloud businesses are posting double-digit growth. But a government crackdown on China's tech champions is casting a long shadow over the sector. And that competition, well, it's only getting more heated. Now, after more than 3 years, the US-educated founder and CEO of Baidu, Robin Li, has agreed to speak exclusively to Bloomberg TV about his company's transformation and about his future. This is a conversation with Baidu CEO Robin Li. You're looking at almost record highs now for Baidu's share price. Do you see that as a validation from investors for this strategy change, this focus on AI, on autonomous vehicles, on semiconductors?
I think our strategy has not changed much over the past 2 or 3 years. It's that the market takes time to realize that autonomous driving or AI has big potential, and Baidu is having a lead on that. So 2 years ago, or even 1 year ago, when we spent a lot of money in AI, in autonomous driving, it was a negative impact to our stock price because you lose money by doing that. It hurts your EPS. Nowadays, it seems that investors' sentiment has changed. They all of a sudden realize that, this thing has a big future, and Baidu's investment in AI and in intelligent driving will someday pay off. And I'm happy that the market has started to pick up this kind of message. But for us, we've been investing not for 1 year, not for 3 years, not for 5 years. We've been investing in AI for more than 10 years. We probably lost a lot of money by doing this, but I think eventually we will be rewarded by doing this.
What is the rationale then for this secondary listing in Hong Kong?
I think it's quite straightforward. Baidu is based in Beijing, and we want investors in Asia, those who are in the same time zone, can easily invest in Baidu. They can have a better opportunity to grow with us. And there were US-China tensions for the past few years. I think investors also have this kind of concerns. Although we're not that concerned about delisting, but I think having another exchange for Baidu stock is overall good for the investors and also good for people around the China area to really share our growth.
And you're really talking about going out on a limb as the business 8 years ago, 10 years ago, to invest in these areas where many others weren't. How much of an advantage then do you think that gives Baidu going forward?
That gives us a lot of advantage because this kind of technical problems are very hard. It takes time and it takes a lot of money to really get that done. Or I would even say today, we're not done yet. We're far from done. We will continue to invest for the next 10, 20 years, and our pace of investment will not slow down. We will continue to add more to our R&D budget so that we will maintain this kind of need. AI is a very broad market, and it can be applied to many, many industries. And there are lots of innovation that can be done when you get into those specific industries. I'm very confident, and also I'm very determined.
What are the growth prospects for the broader business looking like heading into the rest of the year?
This year, we have an easy comp. Last year, because of COVID, our business was affected. So this year, the core business will have a pretty good growth rate. But more importantly, the new business, the new AI-enabled business, be it AI cloud or intelligent driving, it's been growing very fast.
Well, you're right. You saw double-digit growth is what we've seen in terms of your AI-powered smart devices and the cloud unit of the business. Does that growth continue to accelerate?
Yes, especially for AI cloud. We separately disclosed the cloud revenue. Each quarter, you can see that it's growing very quickly, and the growth rate for Q4 was higher than Q3, and the growth rate for Q3 was higher than Q2. So it's quite obvious.
I believe advertising revenue accounts for about 70% of overall revenues. Non-advertising revenue is clearly increasing, as we just touched on.
Yeah.
At what point do you see non-advertising revenue overtaking advertising revenue? And if so, what time frame?
Yeah, it will happen. I cannot see, accurately which year, but I think the trend is quite clear. This is not, Baidu is not alone. If you look at other, large internet companies, most of them, for most of them, advertising is a minority of their revenue.
What kind of acquisitions might you be looking at this stage?
We think technology is at the core competence of Baidu. We would look for technologies that could complement with our own strategy and technology portfolio. But in the meantime, if we are short of, let's say, operating experiences or talents, those are all possibilities.
And would you be looking domestically for those acquisitions primarily, or overseas as well?
I would say primarily domestic. We were more optimistic about international before, but because of the trade tension, it's increasingly difficult for us to invest in the US.
You studied in the US, of course. You built an incredibly successful business here in China. Where do you think the US-China relationship is going ultimately?
My preference is certainly that both countries can work together. And I think by working together, a lot of things can be done faster, and the world will be better off. Like you mentioned, I spent quite a few years in the US. I know the US well, and I love my country. I love China. I think for Baidu's success, we obviously are rooted here in China. We will benefit from a very large market and the government policy to encourage innovation. But we also benefit from our US partners. They supply parts, they help us to grow faster. I would very much like to stay coupled instead of decoupled.
Coming up, why Robin Lee says his autonomous cars could soon be taking on Tesla.
I'm quite confident that we will be able to roll out the most advanced car in terms of autonomy.
Valuations, particularly sort of the technology landscape, have gotten to some pretty extraordinary levels. So I think it's not a surprise. I don't think it's any indication of the beginning of the end, but I do think markets don't like uncertainty.
Our generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
You have a partnership with Geely, one of China's biggest car makers, for autonomous electric vehicles. What is the aspiration with that partnership?
We realize that we have never built cars before and we need help. And Geely is a natural fit because they are one of the leading car makers here in China. They have a lot of experience. They ship millions of cars every year, and they have a good capability of managing the supply chain to ensure the quality and cost, all that kind of things that we're not good at. When I talk to Li Shufu, the founder of Geely, we are very much on the same page. He wanted Baidu to control this car maker company, and we want to get the expertise from their car making experience.
What's the production timeframe? How many units are you targeting?
A car, it really typically would take about 3 years to get a car onto the market. We'll try to get it on the market sooner rather than later. It's probably too early to announce a number of units at this time because it's still early, but I'm quite confident that we will be able to roll out the most advanced car in terms of autonomy.
Before 2024, it sounds like.
That's right.
Okay. And you talked about the competition, Tesla, of course, but also Xiaopeng, NIO. We're also seeing the likes of Foxconn, Huawei, Evergrande, all kind of moving into this space. Very competitive.
Yeah.
Is there a risk of this being oversaturated, this market?
There are, but again, I think this is a very large market. There will be many players instead of just Baidu. But what I think most people don't realize that it requires a lot of investment in R&D, in technology. And we started back in 2013. In the future, I think everybody believes that autonomous feature is the most important feature for an electric vehicle, right? And just the autonomy itself requires a lot of investment in technology. Last year, we spent about 20 billion RMB in R&D. This is more than any other EV company has spent, and probably more than all of them combined, the companies you mentioned. We are determined to spend a lot of money for the next 10, 20 years to make sure we have the best and strongest autonomous platform.
Sounds like Robin Li versus Elon Musk. Do you think you'll be able to take on Tesla?
I think we are quite different. We are an open platform. We want everybody to be successful. We don't just want to build our own cars. So in addition to the venture Jidu, we also supply technology to other OEMs. We want them to use our autonomous driving capability too. We will probably also run a fleet. We will run robot taxi. We want the consumers to enjoy true self-driving cars sooner rather than later. We want to save their ride-hailing cost. There are lots of things we can do, and we will partner with people to do that. So this is very different from Tesla.
Okay. I want to get more on the AI chips focus, because that's really interesting. You've raised about $230 million to develop the chips unit of the business. What are you hoping to achieve ultimately?
Well, it actually started quite a long time ago, probably 10 years ago, when we were running a very large server farm, and we need to customize some of the servers so that it will run faster or cost us less. And we found that by designing our own AI accelerator would do that job. So we started this kind of chip design quite a long time ago with a very simple reason. We want to save money for our servers. So starting from last year, we had our first Kunlun chip on the market. It's not really on the market because over 50% of the chips was used by our own server farm. But it served the purpose, right? We didn't have to pay a very hefty price for third-party, high-end AI chips. We could use our own. It saves money and runs faster. It fits our needs better. But then all of a sudden, I realized this is not just for Baidu. It's actually a lot of industry, a lot of other companies also want this kind of high-end AI chips.
And we're seeing that chip shortage play out globally right now. So it seems like a good move. The Kunlun chip is a 7 nanomillimeter chip. You said you're going to start mass production this year. Has that started? And where do you see most of the demand coming from?
Yeah, the 7 nanometer one is Kunlun 2 is coming up this year, and it's being produced by the fabs. So we do expect that the performance will be 3 times better, and the internal demand is already there. The external demand, we found that is quite strong because, as you mentioned, there's a shortage on high-end chips.
Can you specify which sectors you expect to see most demand from?
It crosses many industries because AI can help in a lot of scenarios, in a lot of cases, and wherever you need high-end chips, be it a data center or edge computing for smart transportation, for energy sector, for education, or for finance, they all need this kind of high-end chips to do complicated AI.
Have there been any discussions internally about spinning that unit off at some point?
Depending on how you define spinning off, we already raised the outside money, so that operation will be run more independently than before. But Baidu is still the controlling shareholder. We will still support them wholeheartedly.
And this focus on AI and on chips dovetails with government policy, the 5-year plan.
Mm-hmm.
How much of that is by accident, by coincidence, by design? How helpful is it?
Well, on the surface, I think it's more like by accident. As I mentioned, we started this like 10 years ago, purely out of our own needs. We just want to save money. But along the way, we gradually realized, this is much more important than just internal use. The whole country, a lot of companies also need this kind of high-end advanced chips. As AI is being adopted by many industries, as people continue to realize that higher computing power can generate better AI results, the market demand skyrocketed. So we feel lucky from this perspective, but it's also kind of more like design because we are a technology company. Our mission is to make the complicated world simpler through technology. This is one of the most important technology in the AI era. If not us, who else can do a better job?
Coming up, China's regulators crack down. Alibaba's been hit. Tencent is in the spotlight. Could Baidu be next?
Asia is absolutely core to our business. It's almost 20% of our franchise revenues globally, which is significantly more than most of our global peers who are more in the mid-teens.
We will invest globally in China. But also, we are also investing in the rest of Asia as well. Our top line growth for the region has been close to 24% last year, almost 20% of the group's revenue as a percentage of the revenue of the group. So, and this is where the group is counting on the growth.
We see company after company, these are corporates committing to net zero. So pretty much across the board, there is an enthusiasm for putting capital to work to try to get us to a better carbon future.
Credit Suisse has a fantastic brand name in Asia. We have obviously strong positions in Singapore and Hong Kong as our two main hubs, but across the region.
Trading revenues coming in better than expected. Everything cash, $1.4 trillion of cash. One of the most notable aspects of this report that was stellar.
Regulators here are now squarely focused on an anti-monopoly regulatory change, reining in financial technology. How do you think the technological regulatory environment is going to change in China? How is it going to impact a business like Baidu?
The country has never emphasized innovation more than they do today, right? Innovation is at the center of China's modernization, according to the official documents. And I think companies like us, we invest, more than 15% of our total revenue every year to do R&D. I think the government like that. And in the meanwhile, I think antitrust is also good for innovation. You just cannot imagine, the number one and number two guy all of a sudden merge and gaining more than 90% of market share in the US. But that happened quite a few times in China before. That's not good for innovation. So I think that the antitrust push is kind of justified.
Baidu has been fined recently for what the regulators say are monopolistic practices, for not flagging deals to the regulators. Is there a risk that you're going to have to unwind some of your deals?
That's not very accurate to say, because the law probably requires a certain kind of deal seek for approval, right? For that particular deal, we did not seek for approval in time, and it doesn't mean that we had monopoly practices. The fine was not for that, and I also think it's not right for the government to block every deal, right? Certain kind of liquidity is also good for innovation. You just cannot do monopoly things.
Are there steps that you're taking now to adjust to the new regulatory environment here?
Yeah, if we do a deal of large scale, we will seek for approval in advance.
The government is also encouraging companies to open up their data. How do you think that is going to play out? Has that started yet, that drive?
It's very much in line with our belief. We run a lot of open platforms for autonomous driving. It's Apollo, right? For AI in general, we have Baidu Brain, which is also open. We have Pedal, the most popular Chinese deep learning framework. Those are also open source. We want a lot of people to use our platform. We're open to everyone. In a lot of cases, it's free for them. It's not only good for the society, it's also good for us. We get a lot of feedbacks.
A lot of the focus has been on Alibaba and Ant and Tencent. Do you feel like Baidu is better off in some ways, that you're slightly sheltered from this?
Well, I can't speak for them, but like I mentioned, we like openness. We want to share data with other partners, and we think that's good for our technology too.
Another big topic here that involves technology, a lot of debate online about this, is the 996, the almost more than 70-hour work week that many technology companies and their employees go through and is the reality for many people. Do you think that push, that drive, the amount of hours that people have to put into their work in tech companies here, do you think that has to change? Do you think that needs to be rethought, 996?
It depends. the employees are voluntary, I think that's okay, especially for those young people. If they want to become more successful, they need to work harder than their peers, right? This is just natural. But if from a company perspective, if you demand them to do 996, I think that's wrong. I think employees have the right to work and to rest and to enjoy life. It's their choice. And at Baidu, we have this kind of philosophy, right? It's really up to you. If you want to work harder, we welcome that. If you want to enjoy life, that's okay too.
I want to switch focus really to you and your future.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen some changes at the top of some of the big tech companies here in China in terms of leadership, some big names stepping down, making way for others. Is there a succession plan at Baidu?
I always wanted to find someone who can replace me as CEO. But in the meantime, I do enjoy my current work. I like technology. I like to see all the changes happen. I like to see, our technology can contribute to the society. So whether I'll be the CEO or not, probably it's not that important. It's just as long as I'm doing things that I like, I will be happy. But having said that, I increasingly spend a lot of time these days to work with the Baidu people so that their capability keep improving, especially in the innovation front. I think I need to train them. I need to inspire them to become more innovative. That's over the past year or so, I spent a lot of time on that.
Okay, so you've been looking for a CEO. Who is your number two, though, Robin?
I wouldn't rank our executives from number 2 to number 10. They're all very talented, hardworking, and has big potential. I want them all to grow and become better.
Okay,
and more successful.
But you're in no rush to retire anytime soon, it sounds like.
If I have to stay on the CEO position, I will.
Robin Lee's ambitious bets on chips and driverless cars has positioned his company to reap the rewards of the next technological revolution. But competition is intense. US-China rivalry could upend the sector, and China's regulations, well, they can change on a dime. Robin Lee will need all the skill and luck he can muster to cement Baidu's position at the top of China's AI table. That was a conversation with Baidu CEO Robin Lee on Bloomberg Television. I'm Tom McKenzie.
Minority myth wasn't something that was fabricated by the Asian Americans. It was created as a tool to alienate the Black and the Asian American communities, and it was incredibly successful.
We know that racism didn't begin yesterday. We know it's probably not going to end tomorrow, but it is our job to make sure that there's progress and we keep people safe, give people dignity.
I spent a lot of time last year to just listen, to understand, to reflect and understand what I could do as a leader of this organization.
For many years, we've been very shareholder focused, and now there really is much more of a community requirement.
The economic downturn in the US, we're seeing unemployment and income losses affecting women more than men.
2/3 of the jobs lost in South Africa were women's jobs. So I think we're in a moment of crisis.
Clearly, our societies are reproducing, not producing inequality.
We need better public policy, and we need companies to step up.
Eric Shansker, and welcome to Bloomberg's Front Row. Today, I'm talking to Dawn Fitzpatrick, Chief Investment Officer at Soros Fund Management. She oversees $27 billion for the legendary George Soros, money he uses to fund his philanthropy. Soros himself was among the most fearless and feared hedge fund managers. Dawn is determined to rekindle that ambition and to shake her reputation for being conservative.
When there is a dislocation, we're prepared, to not just double down, but triple down when the facts and circumstances support that.
Dawn is among the most powerful and influential women on Wall Street. This is what's on her mind: where to invest as the world emerges from COVID-19, the right way to think about ESG, the shocking way some corporate CEOs act towards Soros, leveling the playing field in finance. Here's my conversation with Dawn Fitzpatrick. Dawn, Soros Fund Management is the greatest name in macro investing, a name synonymous with fearlessness and audacious trades. This, after all, was the hedge fund back in the day that broke the Bank of England in 1992. But the words people use to describe the firm today include conservative, safe, and unambitious. Has Soros lost its appetite for risk?
Absolutely not. Back in the spring of 2020, we put over $4 billion to work into the dislocation. When there was a buyer strike, we were the provider of liquidity, and that is not being conservative. We lean into dislocations, and I think if you look at our returns over the last 12 months, again, they speak to really taking advantage of an opportunity set and leaning in. And the other thing I'd say is when you look at the asset management industry generally, a lot of the big platforms that can trade across asset classes have mechanistic stop losses, whereas one of the things the team and I really focused on is making sure that when there is a dislocation, we're prepared, to not just double down, but triple down when the facts and circumstances support that.
So if the returns prove otherwise, what are they like?
So over the last 12 months, we're up just shy of 30%. And we have performed both in private and public markets. And again, I would put our returns and the quality of the returns we produce up against any asset manager or any hedge fund. The team did a great job executing. And again, we played our own game versus playing kind of the game that everyone else can play.
So if conservative, safe, unambitious are the wrong words to describe Soros Fund Management, how would you characterize it? What are the right words to use?
So this platform is just incredibly differentiated, I think, from any other pool of capital in the world. And I think really what we've been focused on is our competitive advantages. And by the way, there are a lot of them. First of all, in the asset management industry, most investment mandates are very, very tightly defined. And usually you have hundreds, if not thousands of clients, and you kind of have to play to the lowest common denominator. Versus at SFM, we have $27 billion of effectively permanent capital. Over 90% of those assets are the Open Society Foundations. So we can invest anywhere, any asset class, and connect the dots across those asset classes and be extraordinarily nimble when there's a dislocation. But also, we can invest, we can hold an asset in perpetuity. Most private assets have to have an exit in 5 to 7 years. We can be a holder that's incredibly long term. So this platform is really, really unique. And what we've tried to do is play to those advantages.
Give me an example. What's one of those differentiated investments? Could be something bold and daring, or could be just something you wouldn't see anywhere else.
So in March, when really once kind of unimaginable was happening, and you had mortgage REITs being forced sellers and forced deleveraging, we were able, in a matter of 48 hours, bid on multi-billion-dollar portfolios. We could underwrite them, we could fund them, and buy them. And again, it's a moment in time post the financial crisis. The amount of capital that can be that nimble is just significantly smaller. Bank balance sheets are very, very pro-cyclical. So our ability to show up in a big way, and make big bets, I think is very differentiated.
Would you say having worked at a hedge fund yourself, would you say you're as nimble as a hedge fund can be?
I think we are more nimble. So think about the biggest multi-strategy hedge funds in the world. They tend...
The Citadels, the Millenniums, the
Yeah.
72s.
All of them, they run levered balance sheets, and they typically have very mechanistic stop losses. So they really are not built to lean into a March dislocation, at least not in the first or second inning. Versus we really are built to do that in a really different way. There's big sovereign wealth funds that can do it, but they're slow and lumbering, I would argue.
Do you have return targets?
No, so as an investor, I think return targets are a little bit dangerous, right? Because in the absence of a good opportunity set, you'll lever up at the exact wrong moment in time. That said, the foundation's spend on average is about $1.25 billion, and because of COVID, 2020 and 2021 are above that level. So the team and my goal is obviously to support that spend and help the foundation continue to grow those assets.
Do you think of performance as an investor in absolute terms or in relative terms?
So I think you have to look at with both lenses, to be fair. As we shifted strategically to lean into those strengths, we gradually picked up momentum in terms of outperformance relative to peers and relative to benchmarks. So 2020 was a good year for us, but it feels like the best is yet to come.
You feel like the best is yet to come. Why?
The team has gelled in a way, I think that's really, really powerful. So instead of having a bunch of portfolio managers that are focused on maximizing their individual outcomes, we have a team that is truly focused on the aggregate results we produce for the foundation. And again, I think market structure, because of regulatory backdrop, has lent itself to being really, really rigid. So being able to be a provider of capital quickly and creatively is just increasingly valuable.
Don, you arrived at Soros with a mandate to make changes that ruffled some feathers, made you a few enemies, and started rumors. What changes have you made and to what end?
I wanted an internal team that was focused on that aggregate result and not individual self kind of optimization. Doing well what we could do internally, maximizing mind share, maximizing the ability to connect dots across asset classes. And then when it comes to our external allocations, really focusing on the managers who are truly differentiated. And there, as I said, there are some, but I think making sure that we had the right internal team and the right external partners was key. And I think, by the way, as a leader, I think everyone wants to be liked, but I've never needed to be liked. And I think the team and the results speak for themselves. I think our strategy was the right one, and it's paying dividends.
You have $27 billion you manage. How is it allocated?
So right now, about half of it, a little less than half, is in private assets, and the bulk of that is traditional private equity. The other half is public markets, and again, that's partially internal, about 75% internal, 25% external. I think people naturally gravitate towards privates
because it prevents them from, in some ways, from buying high and selling low. When you look at the data on private markets relative to public comps and beta adjust, this is the average, not the top decile managers, there's not as much alpha as people think there is there. So from my perspective, we like the opportunity set right now more in public markets. And what we're seeing is in some cases, private valuations are getting ahead of their public market comps. And I think I think you have to be a little bit careful of that. And it's something that we're watching pretty closely. All that said, there are always going to be outstanding private companies and outstanding, private asset managers. But right now, things on the private side feel frothy. On the public side, we're seeing really good opportunities.
Why do you think valuations on the private side are outstripping those on the public side right now? What explains that?
Well, part of it is FOMO. There has been some extraordinary wealth created on the private side of markets, and you see some of these valuations are incredible, and a lot of hedge funds have started to play the late private into public round, and that, by the way, that was an extraordinarily good strategy over the past 24 months. So I think there's some FOMO. I also think COVID really accelerated some secular trends. So again, some of these valuations are warranted because things that would have taken 5 years have happened in the span of 12 months.
So you described some of the things that look appealing. Broadly speaking, where are you taking risks?
So again, equity long short, we see good opportunities there. On the credit side, as I mentioned, we had leaned into residential mortgages back in the spring of last year. We're actually slowly starting to lighten up on that, and we're starting to look at the commercial real estate from an opportunistic perspective. So it feels a little early on things like retail and office, but hotels are starting to get interesting. Interestingly, on the SPAC side, for a while, when it came to their pipes, it was a seller's market, and you had to take the terms. Now it feels like pipes are going to get done where the buyers can be smart structurers, and we think that could get very interesting when the target company is attractive. So the leverage, if you will, not financial leverage, but the negotiating leverage flips from the sponsor to the pipe investor. I think we're at that inflection point. Interesting. Do you have an especially high level of conviction, positive or negative, about strategies or themes? We think the whole infrastructure around crypto is really interesting. And we've been making some investments into that infrastructure. And we think that is at an inflection point. And I think, by the way, when you look at gold price action in the context of a fairly robust inflation narrative of late, it's struggled getting traction. And I think that's because Bitcoin is taking some of its buyer base away. Do you own any Bitcoin? I'm not going to answer that. I want to know how you think about leverage on the one hand and hedges on the other. Yeah, so I think when you think about leverage, you want to think about it in the context of what is term leverage versus overnight leverage. And I think you want to think about it in terms of the assets you're leveraging and the underlying liquidity. So if you, like going back to the mortgage REITs, if you think about what the trouble they got themselves into at the start of 2020, it was about having assets that ultimately weren't as liquid as they thought and not having term around those. And when that happens, you are a forced seller at the exact wrong moment in time. You get carted out. Yeah, 100%. Do you have any hedges on now? We do, absolutely. Both on the rate side and on the public market equity side. Now, is that because you see the risk of
if you will, a further deterioration in the rate market? You're hedged against higher rates on the long end?
Actually, so when it comes to interest rates, absolutely. I think, while I don't think rates are going to get wildly ahead of us, it is a tail risk that you want to be aware of, and every other risk asset in your portfolio will perform badly if that happens. The U.S. Treasury market should be the deepest market in the world. It traditionally has been, but this year we've seen days when liquidity was really genuinely challenged, and to me that creates vulnerability, and it creates an ability for moves that are way and outsized relative to any given headline.
We saw some of the same things in the darkest days of the market meltdown in March of 2020. Not enough liquidity in the Treasury market. What does that say? What's going on under the hood?
So again, it's interesting. A couple things. I think bank balance sheets and the restrictions on bank balance sheets matter. By the way, I thought it was really interesting that the Federal Reserve did not extend the supplemental leverage ratio. So I think that matters. The fact that the Federal Reserve has been monetizing Treasury issuance over the past 12 months also doesn't lend itself to liquidity in Treasury markets. It's almost like issuing a publicly traded stock and then having all the free float owned in one place. So I think that also is problematic.
Dawn, you have said ESG matters a lot to Soros. Why?
I think we can really affect behavior because we own things at the security level, and I think that matters. Obviously, the foundation that we manage money for is and being aligned.
The Open Society Foundation.
Yeah, and I should step back. So the Open Society Foundation is the single largest private funder of human rights initiatives in the world. Their mission is focused on transparency of information, government accountability, promoting democracy, equitable allocation of resources. And it's important to me and the team that the way we invest is consistent with their values. And as an investor, if you're not focused on these factors and these issues, I think you really risk being in stranded assets and being in assets where the cost of capital for those who aren't doing the right thing is going to ratchet higher at an exponential rate, and vice versa for companies that are doing the right thing by society. Cost of capital is getting cheaper.
For those trying to figure out how to think about ESG, what is the right way to think about it? Is it the right thing to do ethically? Is it a way to achieve progress or specific outcomes? Or is it just a way to hedge or mitigate externalities? What's the right way?
So I think it's all of the above. First of all, when ESG first came out, it was about your exclusion list. That is not what ESG is about. From our perspective, it's about both creating the technologies that will allow a smooth transition. So investing in companies like Rivian and battery and EV is really important to us. And then it's also about taking your existing public companies and forcing a level of transparency, both in terms of greenhouse gas exposure, what their plan is to transition to net zero by 2050. When it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, again, shining a light, asking them to disclose what their company looks like. And from our perspective, the more transparency there is, the quicker the progress we will make.
Do they listen? Do those companies listen? Do they answer? I know why they listen and answer to BlackRock, because BlackRock has $10 trillion. Do they listen and answer to you?
I think they do, and I think we're trying to be partners. We're not just saying, hey, check this box and we'll go away. We're trying to work with them in terms of credible plans. We're telling them why this is important to us. And for us, this really is about outcomes, not about checking the box. And I think they appreciate that. And I think every CEO or CFO we talk to genuinely wants help on this journey. And I think we can be part of that.
It goes without saying, George Soros is a living legend of the investment business. What's it like managing money for George?
So I obviously admire George before I had this role, but I have to say, being in this seat, my admiration for him has only grown. He is the most incredible aggregator and assimilator of information I have ever seen. And it is really easy to see why he, is the best investor of all time. He's 90. He's still tireless. He's fearless. All that said, he spends the bulk of his time now focused on the work of the foundation, especially now when that work is so critical. He does, he still has strong opinions. He's not shy about sharing them. And yeah, I feel like it's got them in.
Does he still go on trade?
He's not active in the portfolio at a single trade level. Again, he's focused on the foundation side.
To the degree that he's interested, what is he interested in? What do you find you and he talking about when he wants to have that kind of conversation?
It's the trades that are predicated on a geopolitical view.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
Are the ones that he tends
the foundation of his career.
Yeah, and again, his insights and his ability to gather information is pretty incredible.
George is perpetually the target of conspiracy theories. He's demonized by far-right extremists. You know all of this. To what degree does that get in the way, impede anything that you and your colleagues do at Soros Fund Management?
So, there have been IPOs where a corporate CEO has zeroed us from the book.
Seriously?
Yeah. So that has...
On the basis of political views?
Yes. That said, I just have to believe more people than not view the work George does as a true benefit to society. And I think there are more times that it works to our advantage than to our disadvantage.
I would be remiss in not asking you to name some of those companies that have X'd you out of the allocation.
And by the way, I would love to, but I will not. I will refrain.
Don, the playing field for women in finance still is far from level. I can't say that from experience, but I can certainly see that it's the case. What do you consider the biggest obstacles to advancement for women in finance or investing, whichever you prefer? And what needs to change for those obstacles to disappear?
So I think this is a really important focus, and it's interesting when it comes to women and other underrepresented groups in the asset management and financial industry. I think there's been a narrative, and especially around women, that it's about attrition. McKinsey has done some of the best work in this area, and when you look at it, it's not, the data doesn't really say it's
not people taking themselves out of the equation.
Not first order. What the data shows is it's the first couple rungs in a person's career that are hard to get over. So for women, they are 24% less likely to get the first promotion than men, even though they enter the industry at the exact same rate as men. So one of the things we're kind of committing to do, and we're not a huge organization, we're 200 people, but is to bring in women and other underrepresented groups early in their careers, and then foster them. Don't just bring them as an intern or first year hire, but commit to fostering them over a multi-year progression to set them on a trajectory where they really can be future industry leaders and really commit to their success. But to be clear, it's about getting them over those first couple promotions. And ideally, I obviously want these candidates to stay at SFM. But one of the things we're committed to is if for their career, it's better they go somewhere else, we'll facilitate that, but we won't we'll still be vested in their success.
Don, I read that Blackstone approached you during a recent search for an investment chief in their hedge fund business. Was that something you considered seriously?
So first of all, when John Gray and Steve Schwarzman call, you're going to have the conversation. But I think this is the best job in the investment industry, bar none. And I hope to be here a really long time.
You ran investments at UBS Asset Management before coming to Soros. Would you ever go back to working for a bank?
You know, I hope to finish my career out here at SFM.
Well, there's quite a lot of that career left.
Hopefully.
You're on the lists of all the most powerful and influential women in investing and in finance, deservedly. How do you think about wielding that power and influence?
So I think there's a responsibility there. You know, one thing on those lists is I wish, like, I want to be on lists that aren't qualified by my gender, to be clear. But I do think there's a responsibility. I'm part of an informal group of really senior women in this industry, and we get together a few times a year and do Zooms and other things as well. And we spend a lot of time thinking about how to do that. And we work together. We watch each other's backs. We're sounding boards strategically for each other. And really that didn't exist a couple of years ago in terms of us creating this powerful network. So I'm hoping there's more and more of that. And we're thinking about how to expand that and really watch out for the next generation of women.
Dawn, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mercedes-Benz is on a path towards CO2 neutral mobility. So we have flipped the switch there, and really we're going to step by step electrify everything. And what does that mean? Combustion engines get electrified.
BSO Now is your online home for brand new Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. Discover new releases each week that include behind-the-scenes storytelling with conductors including music director Andres Nelsons, guest composers and musicians, plus critically acclaimed archival concerts and more. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsored by Bank of America.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on futures. That is now being reversed.
This is my kitchen table and also my filing system. Over much of the past 3 decades, I've been an investor. The highest calling of mankind, I've often thought, was private equity. And then I started interviewing.
And while I watch your interviews, Coach, I know how to do some interviews.
I've learned in doing my interviews how leaders make it to the top.
I asked him how much he wanted. He said $250. I said, fine. I didn't negotiate with him. I did no due diligence.
If I have something I'd like to sell, and how they stay there. You don't feel inadequate now because I'm the second wealthiest man in the world. Is that right? One of the most impressive young men I've ever met is Wes Moore. He grew up in my hometown of Baltimore, became a Rhodes Scholar, White House Fellow, Afghanistan war veteran, and for the last 4 years, he's been running Robin Hood Foundation. He's stepping down soon and likely to run for governor of Maryland. He is somebody who's clearly going to make a mark in this world. In fact, has already done so. Welcome, Wes, to our show.
It is so good to be with you as always, David. Thank you.
Tell people what the Robin Hood Foundation is, because recently some people think Robin Hood, they think it's stock trading, but that's not what you do, right? You're not in that Robin Hood, right?
That is not what we do. It was amazing. During the whole GameStop episode, I had people who were blowing up my inbox and saying, unblock my trades. I'm like, I have no idea how to unblock your trades. I wish you luck with that. But the Robin Hood Foundation is a 32-year-old organization with an exclusive goal of ending poverty. And it was started by Paul Tudor Jones and Peter Borsch and a collection of other people who are actually in the investment business. And they started this foundation where they say, we want to be able to take metrics and best practices and invest in the organizations that we think have the highest probability of being able to end this scourge of poverty. And they started off making about $40,000 worth of investments. Now, 32 years later, we have allocated just shy of $4 billion into this work and into this fight. And we fund everything from education to housing, transportation, mental health, physical health, criminal justice reform, anywhere where poverty is either the cause or the consequence. We will find, fund, build, if necessary, all these mechanisms that we think put us on a better pathway of creating a more equitable society.
So how much money does Robin Hood give away annually, let's say?
Yeah, so over the, when we think about a process of the last year, we ended up raising around $240 million. Just in the past 4 years that I've been the CEO, we've raised over $675 million. But the unique thing about our model is actually this, is that, there are certain foundations that will say, okay, we'll take a portion of our endowment and allocate the portion of our endowment into our grant making. Robin Hood's endowment is essentially zero, right? There's a uniqueness of our model is that every dollar we get in, it will go out within the time period of that next calendar year. And so every year on January 1, it's like press go again. We raise and then we get the money out and the capital out as quickly as possible.
But you have staff. Who pays for the staff, all the administrative costs? That usually in some foundations that could be 5 or 10%.
Absolutely, if not more. But the other unique model, the other unique mechanism of Robin Hood's model is actually the fact that our board actually covers all operational expenses.
But COVID must have made it more difficult to raise money or to figure out how to give it away and to run the foundation remotely. So how did you do that?
Yeah, I mean, COVID in this past year was a remarkable year, David. And there was a lot of uncertainty about what does that mean in terms of how we continue to move at a quick and a fast pace, despite the fact we weren't going to be together. How do we consider the fact that we knew how damaging this was going to be on our communities and our community partners? As we saw 11 years of job growth go away in 11 weeks, and we knew which communities would be hit hardest by that. It was our communities. And but I'm so proud of the way that we responded and rebounded. We activated something called the Relief Fund. For only the third time in the history's organization that we've activated the Relief Fund. Once was after 9/11, the other was after Hurricane Sandy, and now the third was COVID-19, where we had a few specific focuses. One was supporting the nonprofit sector, which we knew was going to take an extraordinary hit. And these were all the organizations that were doing the social service work in the city and beyond that needed it. And the second piece was emergency cash assistance, just getting cash into people's hands. We knew that from data that we supported and funded and helped build, that over 40%, around 43% of people could not afford a $400 shock with cash. Well, that shock was here, and it was a lot more than $400. So we knew immediately what you had to do was get cash supports into people that needed it most, and specifically people who we saw government intervention was not touching.
And let me ask you, during COVID, many nonprofit organizations have suffered because they would say their donors don't feel as wealthy as they did before. Did your donors say, you know, not right now, I know it's a problem, but I don't make as much money as I used to, or did you get more money from your donors?
Yeah, we actually saw people who stepped up significantly, and I think there's a couple things that we learned and really helped to unpackage with all of that. One was that the reality was that not everyone was getting financially hurt during this time. That while you did have certain people who did see their incomes decrease, or in many cases their incomes go away, you saw some that actually saw their business increase and their businesses jump. And part of the challenge that we also continue to see was how this separation and this divide and the wealth divide, how it shows itself. And so you had people who that dynamic and that reality showed itself also in philanthropic giving. The second piece was, I think we saw a measure of human pain and a universality of the human pain that was impossible for people not to respond to.
Let's talk about how you became the head of the Robin Hood Foundation, because you're not, you've worked in New York, but you're from Baltimore, as you mentioned earlier, and you're minding your own business. You're in Baltimore, you're living in Baltimore. How did they come to hear of you? And had you been doing anything like this that would have given you the qualification for them to think that you'd be the right person?
Dude, I call myself the most accidental foundation head that you could ever possibly imagine. Because I had no background in philanthropy. They were like, we'd like for you to consider being the CEO of Robin Hood. And I said, I don't know if that makes sense. And I said, I'm thinking of a bunch of reasons why, but let me give you three. And I said, the first reason is, I live in Baltimore. I'm a Marylander and I don't plan on moving. And so I don't know how I would run a New York-based organization when I'm here living in Baltimore. The second piece that I said to them was, I'm enjoying the work that I'm doing here in Maryland. And then the third piece was I said, I've been critical of philanthropy historically. And in fact, the head of the search committee became the chair of the board, and a good friend said, it's all over the internet. We've seen it. We've done our diligence.
Have you realized you're not that persuasive then? You couldn't persuade them not to go after you. But let's talk about your incredible life story, which most people, when they hear about it, they say, how can anybody do all this? So let's talk about this. You were born in Baltimore, and then your father died when you were young. Is that right?
He died when I was about 4 years old. He died in front of me from a rare but a treatable virus.
Your mother said, "Okay, we're going to move you to New York," or she wanted to move to New York. Did you move to the Bronx then?
Yeah. So she was having a really difficult time with the transition. She became a widow in her 20s with 3 children that she was going to raise on her own, and had a really difficult time with it. And eventually she called up her parents, my grandparents, who lived up in the Bronx. You're right, my grandfather was a minister in the South Bronx. My grandmother was a school teacher for 25 years in South Bronx. Both immigrated to this country.
Right.
But their house was barely big enough for them, but they figured out a way to make it big enough for all of us.
All right, so you moved up there, and you were the perfect child. You never got in trouble. Everything worked out well. Is that right?
In my own mind, yeah. No, I mean, I had that was a really hard transition for me. I found myself hurting people that actually did love me, so I could impress people that could care less about me. I mean, I first time that I was handcuffed was when I was 11 years old, and so by the time I was 13, after years of threats of sending me away to this school or sending me away to that school or whatever it was, when I was 13, my mom made good on her threats and she sent me to military school.
All right, you went to a military school, and I assume you weren't dying to go to a military school.
Yeah, it wasn't my first choice.
So they straightened you out a little bit or something like that?
They did. Well, it took a little while, David. And, I ran away. I think I ran away 5 times in the first 4 days.
All right, so eventually you go to a military college. Is that right?
That's correct.
Junior college?
I did. I graduated from high school, and then I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And honestly, for many people in my life, particularly a lot of the men in my life who were my mentors at that point, and the people I admired, they all had one thing in common, and that's they all wore the uniform of this country. And so I joined the Army, and then I went to a military college.
All right, but then you eventually went to Johns Hopkins.
Good.
Is that right?
That's right.
And at Johns Hopkins, you must have done reasonably well because you were elected as a Rhodes Scholar.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes people that win Rhodes scholarships, they go to Oxford, they get a degree, or they don't get a degree, then they come back and say, okay, I'm going to go to Harvard Law School, Yale Law School, I'm going to go into something important like private equity, whatever it might be, right? What did you decide to do? How come you didn't go to Harvard or Yale Law School or some other great law school? How come you decided to do something that probably not that many Rhodes Scholars were doing?
Well, at first I actually went to the world of finance, and I was there for a little while working at Deutsche Bank in London, and it was great and it was nice. And then I tell you, David, I remember getting a phone call, and I was brand new analyst working on deals, and it was from my good buddy at that time, Major Mike Fenzel, who was with the 82nd Airborne Division, and he said something to me that he said, so when are you going to get into the fight? And that was indicting for me, as because I trained. I'm a paratrooper. I'd gone through all my training with my soldiers, and as my soldiers are now deploying to Afghanistan and deploying to Iraq, I was working in high finance, and I literally went back and thought about it and prayed on it, and I went back and called him back up, I think a couple of days later, and said, Mike, I'm in. And so I ended up they ended up doing a by name request for me. And I left finance, and I went and I joined up with the 82nd Airborne Division. I went actually down to Fort Benning to go do my training and moved up. And then literally probably around 9 months after that conversation that I had in the stairwell of Deutsche Bank with Mike Fenzel, I was getting ready to deploy with the 82nd Airborne to Afghanistan.
All right, so you go to Afghanistan, but did you ask for an office job there, something that you could kind of not be shot at or something like that?
No, not at all. I was very clear. You know, I went over and I led a group of paratroopers as a special operations officer. They were working, you know, information operations, psyops, which is, you know, psychological operations, and we were very much in the field. And you know what was interesting is that so much of the conversation at that time, in 2005, was Iraq. You know, we had about 150,000 troops in Iraq at the time. In Afghanistan, we only had about 17,000 troops. And so I remember actually when I got deployment orders for Afghanistan, there were a lot of people like, oof, you know, at least you're not going to Iraq. Not knowing the kind of fighting that was going on in Afghanistan at that time. And literally within the first days of Afghanistan, I started seeing firsthand, you know, when you see a first firefight, you start seeing just what kind of fighting was going on in Afghanistan.
So how long were you over there?
I was over for a little shy of a year, probably 10 and a half months.
Okay, then you came back to the United States?
I did.
And what did you do then?
Then I actually started working back in, so I did a White House fellowship. Mike Pence, the same gentleman, was a former White House fellow. And actually I came back from a mission one night and he said, I want you to apply for this thing called the White House Fellowship. And he said, you know, it's important for people back in Washington to get a firsthand understanding of the year that you're having right now, so they can actually see what's going on the ground. So I applied for a White House fellowship. I was blessed to receive it, and I had the honor of working under then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and her team, which was just an unbelievable and a life-shifting experience for me to be able to go through that.
Okay, so after the White House fellowship, you worked for Condoleezza Rice. Did your mother say, now can you get a serious job that's a full-time thing, make some money? Is that what you finally decided to do? What did you do?
I did. At that time, my mother was like, all right, slow down and start actually preparing a family. And also, I was newly married now at that point too. So now you really are starting to think about, all right, what are the things that you want to be able to do? And I started thinking about the things that I was interested in, the skill sets that I'd had. And so I decided that, so maybe I should try to give finance a shot. And then I had the pleasure then of working at Citi and working for a few years at Citi at first as a analyst associate, then a vice president, just working on collections of deals.
So you moved to New York?
I then moved to New York, yes. Yeah, so we were living in Maryland when I got back from Afghanistan and moved to New York for a few years.
Okay. Then when did you move back to Baltimore?
I remember having a conversation with another mentor of mine, a person who was running investment banking, now is running Premier, Ray McGuire. And I went to him and I said, I think it's time for me to do something different. I just finished actually writing a book called The Other Westmore, which was an important process in time for me just to also be reflective about my own life. And that's when I said I made the decision that I really wanted to leave finance and to go focus on these issues that are really my life's burning issues.
So now you are going to be leaving shortly Robinhood. Are you going to pursue what I call the higher calling of private equity, or are you thinking of doing something else?
I know the issues I want to get done. I know the work I want to try to do. I'm thinking about what's the right platform.
Asia is absolutely core to our business. It's almost 20% of our franchise revenues globally, which is significantly more than most of our global peers who are more in the mid-teens.
We want to invest globally in China, but also we are also investing in the rest of Asia as well. Our top line growth for the region has been close to 24% last year, almost 20% of the group's revenue as a percentage of the revenue of the group. So, and this is where the group is counting on the growth.
We see company after company, these are corporates committing to net zero. So pretty much across the board, there is an enthusiasm for putting capital to work to try to get us to a better carbon future.
Credit Suisse has a fantastic brand name in Asia. We have obviously strong positions in Singapore and Hong Kong as our two main hubs, but across the region.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on futures. That has now been reversed.
PSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archival concerts. Visit pso.org/now, where the music plays on. PSO season sponsor, Bank of America.
Being a Rhodes Scholar and a White House Fellow isn't enough. You have to write a book as well to make everybody else look bad because you're doing too many things. So tell people now who are watching who the other Westmore was.
It was, in fact, right after I got the Rhodes Scholarship, the Baltimore Sun, which is our hometown paper, wrote this article about this local kid who just got an award and was now getting ready to head out to England on this scholarship. And at the same time, they were writing a whole series of articles about 4 guys who walked into a jewelry store and attempted to rob the jewelry store. And in this botched jewelry store robbery, ended up murdering an off-duty police officer. And there was a 12-day national manhunt for these 4 guys. And finally, after 12 days, all 4 guys were caught. One of the people that was eventually caught was a guy who's, we were living in the same area. We were around the same age. We both grew up in single-parent households. And his name was also Westmore. And I reached out to him and I wrote him this note. He wrote me a note back, and eventually that singular note turned to dozens of notes. Those dozens of notes turned to dozens of visits. I've now known Wes for almost 2 decades. But at the same time I was getting ready to head out to England, he was getting ready to start his life sentence in prison. And so The Other Westmore was a book that really evolved from our years of friendship, and about these 2 kids and what ends up happening that causes this split amongst these 2 kids with similar backgrounds, to include names.
So you've now written 5 books. One of them is about Freddie Gray. And this was a person who was taken into a police paddy wagon and en route to the police station, I guess, died and caused riots in Baltimore and so forth. What is your own view now on whether the racial situation in the United States, because of examples like Freddie Gray or George Floyd, have gotten worse than when you were growing up? Or do you see any progress being made?
Yeah, I mean, I see the potential for progress being made, and the potential for progress being made is the fact that we're now understanding and talking about this as not just isolated incidences, but we're understanding the longevity and the lineage of this. That the damage of George Floyd wasn't just the fact that we watched a homicide on camera, but it was the fact that his name gets added to a much longer lineage of names that there's just been no accountability for, right? But it also comes down to the fact that we watch how these acts and we watch how these issues of systemic racism do show themselves in not just policing, whether you're talking about educational attainment, whether you're talking about wealth, whether you're talking about maternal mortality, whether you're talking about basic asset allocation. It's race. And it's impossible to understand this without disaggregating the importance of it. And so I think that the platform for progress is the fact that we are now having a mature and an honest conversation about what is it going to take for us to move into a better space, and a place where we're watching it's not just oppressed populations who are demanding justice. And that's the power of this moment.
Many African-American men of your age or older have told me of their own life experiences where they were stopped by police for things that didn't seem appropriate at the time for them, certainly. Have you had those run-ins with the police since you've been an adult?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But it's both the fact that we've had these interactions and the fact that the sound of a police siren It just has a different pitch depending on what neighborhood you're in. And your heart rate speeds up in a different way when you're already anticipating the fact that this encounter could go wrong, and how it could be interpreted by other people. But it's also the fact that, you know, that I as a father now, that I know that I'm going to be forced to have conversations that other people are not going to be forced to have with our children.
So now you are going to be leaving shortly, Robinhood. You're going to go live in Baltimore. Are you going to pursue what I call the higher calling of private equity, or are you thinking of doing something else? I've read in the newspapers that you're thinking of running for governor of Maryland. Is there any truth to that?
I am exploring running for governor of Maryland, and you know, and I'm thinking about it just in terms of I know I want to focus on true systems change. I think we're just at a very crucial point where on issues that I have spent my entire adult life on, whether they be ending child poverty, whether it be eliminating the racial wealth gap, about how do we think about education in a fair way, that we're actually providing real pathways for our students. These are all issues that are right in front of us right now, and we're making generational decisions right now. And so I know the work, I know the issues I want to get done, I know the work I want to try to do. I'm thinking about what's the right platform. And I think that there is not just a unique potential, you know, a lane, but there's a unique way to be able to, you know, finally put in any of the issues I care about.
Suppose the President of the United States is watching this and he says, Wes, look, running for office, that's tough. Why don't you come in, I'll give you a senior job in the administration, become a cabinet officer or something. Would you go in the Biden administration, or you really want to run for office in the governorship of Maryland?
Yeah, no, I mean, I have a deep admiration for all folks who choose to serve in administrations. I also know that I'm at the stage of my career as well where I know my skill sets, and I know what I'm good at, and I'm a pretty good executive. I know how to run things and run large organizations, and I've worked within and with government my entire career, and I know that for me this is not about I want to go into politics. For me, this is about the fact that the executive role, who actually controls the budget, who has a chance to actually change a destiny for a generation of children and families, that's something that makes my heart beat faster. And that's what makes me excited.
So people who are watching, they would say, okay, after he got his life together, he won a Rhodes Scholarship, White House Scholarship, written 5 books, hence Robinhood, happily married, 2 kids. This is a perfect picture. Make us feel that we're not so inadequate ourselves. Tell us something you're doing that doesn't work out, where you failed or something, so we can feel that we're just not watching a superhuman. We want to watch somebody who has, you know, mistakes or fail. There's something you can say you're not good at.
Let me tell you something. There is plenty that I am not good at and plenty that I've failed at. But I tell you one thing about me, David, is I'm not afraid to fail.
Every Friday with 30 minutes dedicated to fixed income, I'm Jonathan Ferro. This is Bloomberg Real Yield.
Is there anything you think the Fed should be able to do to help people who are really suffering in the pandemic, I think they need to be in the room with us as we make our decisions about monetary policy.
Right now, about half of U.S. households invest. We'd like to get that number up to 95+%. Investing should be as ubiquitous as shopping online. It should just be something that people do.
The coronavirus pandemic has changed billions of lives in countless ways. It's marked our day-to-day beyond recognition, converting the impossible to imagine into daily routines. Barren offices have left the busiest sections of cities abandoned, while unemployment and uncertainty plague economies. Faceless, masked populations observe a quote social distance, one of the many terms coined in the year of the pandemic. And while the outbreak has taught us a lot about limits, it's also shown how strong leadership can convert the once impossible into reality. Before last year, it was almost unheard of for a vaccine to be developed in under 5 years.
Hopefully, we can move along rather rapidly to get an answer. Are they safe and effective in a timely manner, which I've said right from the beginning would likely be a year to a year and a half.
But scientists across the world have managed to produce 9 effective coronavirus vaccines in 2020. One such drug is mRNA-1273. You'll know it as the Moderna vaccine. The drug bears the company's name. The leader is founder and chairman Noubar Afeyan. Today, he's based in Massachusetts, but Afeyan's path to the US was all but straightforward. Afeyan was born in Beirut to parents who survived the Armenian genocide. Lebanon's civil war drove his family to Canada in the 1970s. Afeyan eventually moved to the US for a PhD in biochemical engineering at MIT, and he's been there ever since. These experiences shaped him as a person and as a leader. He says he's dedicated his career to improving the human condition through science. Today, on Leaders with ｗ, we meet Noubar Afeyan. How has your childhood impacted the entrepreneur you've become?
I was, in fact, born in the Middle East in Lebanon, of Armenian parents. Lebanon was quite a cosmopolitan place from childhood. I had lots of different influences and different cultures that I thought were quite normal to be intermixed and lots of new ideas from all over the world. I think that unfortunately, growing up at 13 years old, we were forced to leave the country due to a civil war that had just started. And fortunately, the country of Canada took our family in as essentially political refugees. And that was probably the beginning of a set of changes in my life that got me accustomed to change, to not fearing a new environment and a new set of challenges. And then I think, probably the environment in the Middle East early on of kind of people having a long history of ideas and trade and how to think about business, and in my case, science over time. I'm sure those are all things that had influence, but I must say I wasn't aware of them until much later in my life when I started doing a set of things that I began to draw from those early experiences on. I'll say the last thing is that having seen 9 months of the Civil War, having seen the building next to the building I grew up in explode, completely come down to the ground, and the consequences of fatalities there at a young age, that adversity probably made me somewhat tougher and more accepting of what would otherwise probably be extremely worrisome challenges in my business life. There were lots of ups and downs, and when you put it in the context of a country in civil war and the challenges there, it does make you realize that these are relatively small things to overcome.
You immigrated to Canada and then to the US. The immigrants have a different idea of business.
Physical immigrants have already undergone the kind of trauma of being uprooted, rerouted, going from feeling familiar to completely unfamiliar, therefore disadvantaged, and having to struggle to make a go of it. And those set of experiences absolutely come in handy, both in startups, which are very much an act of survival and ultimately triumph if we can get there, but also innovation. And that's the second thing I want to say, which is that immigrants also embody a mindset that is all about going to someplace new and accepting a new reality. And I've come over the years to view innovation as nothing more than intellectual immigration.
You were interested in things where no one else was. I think you have a PhD in biochemical engineering. At the time, it was such a startup almost in what we were studying. Why did you go into that?
Well, I actually went to an undergraduate program at McGill University in Montreal in chemical engineering. And I've thought about it in hindsight, but around the time I was graduating, I started realizing that I did not want to do what traditional chemical engineering was all about, which at that time was special chemicals and plastics and many important fields. But I was drawn to things that were quite new and where nothing was known. And biology in 1982-83 timeframe was just beginning to become the object of the affection of engineers, just beginning. And so I was drawn to it, to be at a frontier. And look, I've explained it this way. I don't consider myself to have any natural gift or any advantages intellectually, but I do know one thing, that in the frontier, there's so few people that I don't need a big advantage to be able to actually do something because the crowd wins out.
But what's your philosophy in that flagship? So that there must be, 100 ideas a day, and maybe 4 of those work. So how do you pick those 4 and not the other 96?
Well, flagship is an attempt to institutionalize 2 things that society considers completely individual and improvisational. That is making breakthrough innovations and starting new companies. Both of those today we consider as quite rarefied, unlikely to succeed at. And 21 years ago, almost to the day, we set out to institutionalize those 2 things. Now, I say that because how Flagship operates has a process and a systematic nature, and our whole process embraces the notion of evolution, Darwinian evolution. And Darwinian evolution is basically variation, selection, and iteration. We simply apply that idea to new thought, to new original ideas. That is, we create variation, lots of different versions of the ideas. We create selection pressure, lots of different people tell us how bad our ideas are, why they won't work. And then iteration, where we overcome the objections long before we even go into a lab to test out the ideas. And that process produces almost the survival of the fittest. So it is not our approach as investors to be choosing winners and losers. We allow the winners and losers to compete for our attention and our involvement. And the ones that are meritorious get that attention, and those are the ones we build. It's a very different way. We don't choose, we let the process lead to the winners emerging. And that's what allowed us to systematize and over the years create well over 100 companies in this way.
Up next, Uber Afrian tells us how Moderna got ahead.
Of course, we had a public health duty to respond, but boy, did we not sit there and say, and 9 months from now, we're going to have a vaccine, and 12 months from now, it's going to be 100 million people. That is the consequence. Frankly, I think if we thought about that, we probably would have gotten scared.
Model minority myth wasn't something that was fabricated by the Asian Americans. It was created as a tool to alienate the Black and the Asian American communities, and it was incredibly successful.
We know the racism didn't begin yesterday. We know it's probably not going to end tomorrow, but it is our job to make sure that there's progress and we keep people safe, give people dignity.
I spent a lot of time last year to just listen to understand
to reflect and understand what I could do as a leader of this organization.
For many years, we've been very shareholder focused, and now there really is much more of a community requirement.
The economic downturn in the US, we're seeing unemployment and income losses affecting women more than men.
2/3 of the jobs lost in South Africa were women's jobs. So I think we're in a moment of crisis.
Clearly, our societies are reproducing, not producing inequality.
We need better public policy and we need companies to step up.
Nine vaccines have so far proven they can protect people from developing symptoms of COVID-19. One among them, Moderna's two-part shot, which is 94.5% effective. But the genesis of the vaccine predates the pandemic by some time. The biotech firm, founded and led by Nubar Afeyan, was already in talks with US authorities to test its vaccine manufacturing capacity. Despite the head start, the journey to develop a COVID-19 vaccine using messenger RNA technology was hardly a bed of roses. Only Pfizer has come up with another shot using this groundbreaking technology. When Afeyan started exploring the idea of mRNA biotech in 2010, there was little information about how it might work. At the time, he said they didn't know if mRNA could effectively get into human cells, or whether it would cause a negative immune reaction. But after many trials, and with the health agencies across the world approving the vaccine, the method has proven effective. Moderna will be among the small group of companies whose medical breakthroughs helped pull humanity out of the pandemic.
Is there a problem of actually pitting the health versus economy? Is this what's made it more difficult at the start?
In this particular pandemic, certainly once we were afflicted and it was coming on like a tsunami of viral attack, it was too late for sure. And so I think that the steps suggested, especially given the lack of experience that people had, last time this happened was 100 years ago, people barely traveled, and so the conditions were so different that people threw out all the playbooks. And so yes, I think that there were economic self-preservation, getting the next vote, all sorts of things that motivated, political actors to do what they do. And the World Health Organization was in no position, by the way, in a period where global institutions are under unprecedented attack of their, legitimacy or their usefulness. Of course, it was a perfect storm of conditions that allowed the virus to do maybe not the maximal harm, but damn close to the maximal harm.
Did you ever dream of finding a vaccine so quickly in the midst of a global pandemic?
No, because I'm so, and the whole team we have here, as well as in our company, are so focused on platforms as opposed to the output of the platforms, that interestingly, we find ourselves, I sometimes liken to people as, we make instruments, and then there's, people that are performers that play music on our instrument. And so, because in this case, the instrument now all of a sudden enables a form of music that is helping the world, we don't fantasize over the music, we actually dream up what would be an instrument that would actually allow beautiful music to be made. I'm using, an artistic analogy, but it really is the same thing. Our focus is the impact comes from the fact that we enable a platform out of which dozens and dozens of solutions come. And so, when the pandemic came, for us it was a great, I remember it very well, January 21st, my daughter's birthday, is the first time I had a discussion with Stefan Mansell, where he called me from Europe, where he had some discussions for the first time. This was being discussed. And I thought, great, here's an opportunity to test our instrument, our platform, mRNA, in a very rapid turnaround application. So we were, of course we had a public health duty to respond, but boy did we not sit there and say, and 9 months from now we're going to have a vaccine, and 12 months from now it's going to be 100 million people. That is a consequence. Frankly, I think if we had thought about that, we probably would have gotten scared. We didn't think much about that. We thought that's 6 steps beyond where we are. If we just do every single step well, we have a chance of getting there.
Does your vaccine and the mRNA technology actually change everything going forward? What's the use of it? First of all, can you adapt this vaccine to new variants of COVID-19? And does it change the cures for cancer? Does it change other problems, for example, in genetic conditions?
Well, the vaccine doesn't do that. The vaccine has simply alerted the world that what we do might have that promise, and it's up to us to prove that it can do that. So I think that the promise of messenger RNA was evident to some of us 10 years ago, more people 5 years ago when we started attracting significant private capital, eventually in 2018 when we did a public offering. But more and more the burden is on us to show that it can be broadly applicable. What we now know is that we can manufacture it at scales that no pharmaceutical or vaccine has ever been made up before, from a volume standpoint. We've gone from being the tiniest in output pharmaceutical company to among the biggest in certainly output of volume. And so I think that messenger RNA will take its proper place in the arsenal of medicine. How many things it applies to, we believe being an information molecule, it is going to be useful for many, many things well beyond vaccines. We have a dozen programs that are not in vaccines that are using messenger RNA. But it's up to us to prove it. I do not want to make grandiose claims that this changes everything. Certainly, people working on vaccines, I'll give some thought as to why the next one should take 5 years instead of a year or two. It'll change some of the regulatory mindset, perhaps, but I sure hope that this experience changes people's willingness to relent to the fact that sickness happens and there's not much we can do about it.
Do you think it will? Or there are a lot of people that, of course, question that. It was unclear actually in the beginning, with even regulators coming up with, things that could make other people question what exactly mRNA did. Do you need more transparency? Do you have worries that there's an anti-vaxxer movement that's also becoming stronger almost by the day?
Well, that's several questions in one. Let me just quickly unpack and say that I don't envy the regulators in having had to go from a start in the beginning of last year to being able to know so much about the science and the technology to be able to effectively regulate it. Nobody wants more than us, a proper regulator engaged in ensuring that what we're doing ensures then the safety of those who receive the vaccine. And for that, we needed heroic effort by the FDA, by the European regulators, etc. So, and we got that, and I truly commend them. Anybody who says that corners were cut and people didn't know what they were doing, except for the fact that people did not know that it may not work and did not accept that, which we did not. People knew what they were doing, and they did it well. Now, having done it now, how will that affect how they think about the next wave of vaccines? So, question back to you would be, are you going to be willing to sit next to somebody clearly suffering from raging flu on an airplane simply by knowing that it's not COVID? We've accepted, transmitting to each other, otherwise also deadly diseases, maybe not as deadly as this, but 30, 40, 50,000 people dying a year from just flu is problematic. Do we now think that some of these technologies could address that much better than the 50%, again, defeatist level we've accepted for flu vaccine? I believe that's the case. And society going to demand it? Let's see.
Up next, do leaders work 9 to 5? How much do you love Dolly Parton?
Surprisingly, when I learned that she had chosen to make a donation in one of our sites to support their work with respect to our vaccine, I was pleased that our arts have connected ever so indirectly.
Market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Farrow Mornings with Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz. Extraordinary market day.
This rally just keeps on going.
But there is a tipping point.
The business team you love to watch. Weekday mornings on Bloomberg Television.
Entrepreneurs spend a lot of time wondering where their next big idea will come from. Having launched his first company at the age of 24, Nubar Afeyan fits the definition of a serial entrepreneur. At 48, he founded the now world-famous biotech firm Moderna. The company's mission statement embodies the hyperactivity of its founder. Instead of waiting for problems to turn up, Moderna seeks out the next challenge and tries to offer solutions before issues arise. 9 years after the company was founded, the pandemic hit. And for Nubar Afeyan, being out in front has paid off. The chairman of Moderna firmly believes preparing for the unknown can transform how the field of medicine tackles problems. Nubar Afeyan is still with us. Do you remember that first conversation with your first investor? What was that like?
My first meeting with the first investor I ever had was the day after Black Monday in 1987, in October, when the market crashed. Wow. I was 24 years old, and I just graduated after a few months from my PhD, and literally I had no idea why the stock market crashing would ever affect the very first venture capitalist I met. His name was Ginger Moore. She was one of the absolute giants in the venture capital business in biotech already back in 1983. And I went to see her. It was a place called Hope Capital Management. I remember it like it was yesterday. All full of hope and pride, and they were devastated. And it was like an operating room. It was bleeding all over the place, financially bleeding all over the place. And it was interesting because she told me at the time, listen, if you want to continue doing this may be the best time because nobody else is going to do a startup in this environment. But she also explained to me why NASDAQ and Dow crashing would lead to venture capitalists not wanting to put money out and how the financial system was intertwined. It's really stuck with me because during the internet bubble that burst, I used to teach at MIT at the time, and I used to tell my students, this is the time when real entrepreneurs start companies, not entrepreneurs who think it's really easy. And so it's a better time to really wade into this because you're not going to have to answer why your idea is different than 100 other people. Maybe it'll be one other idea you have to defend against. So that's how we started.
What kind of leader are you? How would you describe yourself in your leadership style?
I would say certainly I'm a leader that works on figuring out destinations that we should aim for and then chooses the direction as opposed to the other way around. I'm a leader that rather attracts and works with people who have both expertise, experience, but also creativity and appetite that far exceeds mine, even though I can give them a bit of a run for their money, because I think that's whether that's through diversity in background, diversity in age, diversity in even kind of fields of expertise. If you saw my team up close, it's just an incredible melange of folks that we're fellow journeymen and journeywomen, if there's such a word, in the sense that we're learning. So I'd say it's really and a level of transparency very early on. I concluded that you cannot in a startup pretend you know what's going to happen because you don't. And many leaders, try to project a level of certainty about what's going to happen in order for others to follow them. I'd rather project uncertainty about what's going to happen so that people kind of cuddle up and make sure we can go forward together versus with false confidence. I'll say one last thing, and it's less about the leader, but it's about my mindset. Years and years ago when I was asked by MIT to teach, I told myself you can never teach these things. I decided to instead of teaching, try to help people learn, which I convinced myself was a different activity, and it turned out to be. And I thought, what would I have wanted to know going into this space about the mindset that it takes to innovate in a breakthrough way? And what I've concluded is that mindset is best defined as paranoid optimism. And that's a combination of words that back in 25 years ago when I first started using it, you couldn't do a Google search, well, there was no Google, but you couldn't do a Google search on. But now I think many people realize that it's one thing to be a cautious optimist, but a paranoid optimist needs to be rather an optimist, but they're constantly doubting their assumptions. And they're constantly assuming things are going to change. So there's a level of almost a tortured mindset between projecting, believing, acting, but questioning.
How much do you love Dolly Parton? Did you love her before she invested in the Moderna vaccine?
No. Dolly Parton was when I grew up, she was an iconic. Look, I came to this country knowing very little about American culture, and even at the time, I viewed her as one of the iconic artists, and she was definitely a personality, and so that's how I knew her. I knew a bit of her music. I knew she made movies. So I found her to be an interesting kind of person. I almost felt like she embodied a piece of Americana, if you will, in her life and in her behavior. Then, quite surprisingly, when I learned that she had chosen to make a donation in one of our sites to support their work with respect to our vaccine, I was pleased that our arts have connected ever so indirectly through a common interest in this activity.
I'm very happy that I'm going to get my Moderna shot today.
And of course, I think whatever accolades she's getting for having contributed to this cause generally is deserved, and everybody out there doing they can.
I know you teach, you play basketball. There's a number of things that you do, and you work full time almost all of the time. What's the thing you've missed the most, actually, in the last 12 months because of the pandemic, because of lockdowns?
Look, there's plenty of stuff we all miss. I miss my family in Sweden. My wife is from there. I spent every summer a chunk of time there. That's been cut off, and in a funny way, having lived in a civil war early on in March when this whole thing shut down, I thought people was going to feel like a civil war in the sense that we're going to be accepting things we would have never thought possible. Fortunately, it's not people killing people, but unfortunately, it is other natural forces killing people. And I'll say that it's hurt me personally. It's taken away a member of my family in Sweden, and it happened very early on, and that's made the cause of working on this even more personal and even more difficult, because every time I talk about the vaccine, every time I talk about people suffering, I remember my father-in-law.
Nubar Afeyan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Trading revenues coming in better than expected. Everything cash. $1.4 trillion of cash. One of the most notable aspects of this report that is stellar.
It's such an interesting new world.
The world is changing. For us, it's not about being first. It's about being the best.
While everyone is zigging, we're zagging. We feel like we can maybe help people out more.
We have an enormous number of big ideas.
This is really an extraordinary moment, I think, in terms of thinking about cures for genetic disorders.
Global markets never sleep, so stay connected with Francine Lacroix in London, Matt Miller in Berlin, and Kaylee Lyons in New York. Perspective on the day ahead. Bloomberg Surveillance, early edition. Weekday mornings on Bloomberg Television.
Don't bring me no bad news. Markets shrug off higher consumer prices and even a vaccination program put on hold as they see a glass more than half full. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. This week, contributors Larry Summers of Harvard.
Over the next decade,
I think we've got more to fear from microbes than we do from Xi Jinping.
And former IBM CEO Sam Palmisano. Bank of America Chairman and CEO Brian Moynihan.
Our loans fell largely because people are paying us off because they have so much cash sitting around.
Nancy Davis of Quadratic Capital.
I don't know why people wouldn't have inflation in their portfolio.
And Laird Lenman of TCW. If investors were looking for something to shake their confidence, this might have been the week for it. Consumer price numbers rose substantially, more than was expected, and we're not done yet.
We are really focused on the progress of the economy toward those goals and not on a particular time frame.
And if fears of inflation weren't enough, the CDC and FDA suddenly announced that we should stop vaccinating people with the Johnson & Johnson coronavirus vaccine, at least until they figure out what's going on with a handful of very serious cases of blood clots.
That's why you see the word pause. In other words, you want to hold off for a bit and very well may go back to that, maybe with some conditions or maybe not.
But the markets took it all in stride, with the banks posting earnings no one could have dreamed of just a year ago, and the S&P and Dow and NASDAQ 100 all reaching new record highs. Even the U.S. Treasury 10-year barely blinked on the J&J news, with the yield ticking up only for a moment and then turning around and dropping the most since February. To help us understand the market reaction, or maybe lack of reaction, we're joined now by our Wall Street Week roundtable. Nancy Davis, Chief Investment Officer at Quadratic Capital, and also Laird Landman. He is a portfolio manager for fixed income at TCW. So welcome, both of you. Laird, let me start with you. You are a fixed income guy. One of the big questions I think on investors' minds right now is inflation. Is it transitory, as Jay Powell tells us, or could it be more troubling than that? And as you look at the fixed income market, what do you look at to answer that question?
Well, I think it's very hard to know what to look at. In the 60s, people looked at the Phillips curve. In the 70s, the theory of inflation was that it was monetary in all places. You looked at M2 growth. In the 90s, it was P star. There's been all different models, and none of them have really worked. Today, we're clearly moved into a direction of this modern monetary theory. One of my favorite charts you can pull up on your terminal is just chart the budget deficit versus the growth in the Fed balance sheet. It's a one-for-one sort of item. So if anyone thinks we're not in modern monetary policy world, take a hard look at that. And I think that given that, it's going to be very difficult to know whether inflation is going to be real or transitory. But as we increase the amount of government spending going on, and as we move from the government transferring money to individuals to actually spending the money themselves, I believe the price elasticities will change, and you'll actually see more persistent inflation. So that's something we're focused on, is the idea that government spending does tend to be subject to more inflationary pressures, and they will also crowd out, as they do infrastructure, they're going to crowd out traditional commodities like copper, lumber, steel.
So, Nancy, you actually try to hedge against inflation with your IVOL ETF. Give us a sense of what you look at on inflation, because in addition to what Laird said, for example, you look at money supply, and I mean, like M2, I think has increased by more than 25% year over year.
I mean, if you look at the data and you look at what's happening in reality between the Fed having an average inflation target, between having fiscal spending, between having the Fed not even thinking about raising rates, and a blue wave right now, and relative to the rest of the world, really exporting inflation now from emerging market companies and countries, I don't know why people wouldn't have inflation in their portfolio. To me, it's sort of like, why would you take a risk and take a bet? To me, inflation is actually a bigger risk to investors than a recession. Because if you think about what, not healthy, normal inflation, but if we had runaway inflation, that would decrease our purchasing power, right? The cost of drugs, the cost of housing, the cost of travel, especially if we have a weaker dollar. To me, I don't see why people are thinking or overthinking it. I think you should just have a diversified portfolio, and just because we haven't had runaway inflation for many years doesn't mean we're not going to have it in the future.
So Laird, assuming for a moment that there is a significant risk, one that an investor needs to take into account of inflation, what do you do? I mean, when I think of fixed income, you're an expert, I'm not, but I think inflation is not necessarily good for bond values.
We would love to argue our asset class here. We would always love to argue it, but I think our fiduciary responsibility says that, looking for high returns from fixed income in this environment is probably, there will be areas in the fixed income markets that can generate high returns, but in general, I think you have to be concerned that rates could go higher here before the Fed kind of wakes up and goes from thinking about to thinking about at some point actually taking action. If you're going to protect yourself, I think you look to, what is the government going to crowd out? Where are the price elasticities going to become very sensitive? And I think you look at copper, and I think you look at some of the industrial metals, and I think you look at lumber, and you look at where the housing market is today. And there's a story this morning that supply in Greenwich is down 44% for houses. There's going to be building in the private sector. There's going to be building in the public sector. And I think you position yourself to benefit from that.
So Nancy, from your point of view, because this is really what you do, how do you hedge for inflation? You have your IVOL ETF. That's one alternative, I assume. What do you recommend in terms of hedging for the possibility of inflation?
Well, I know a lot of people look at commodities, as Laird was pointing out, and I know a lot of people look at some equities and some sectors in the markets. To me, and what we do with IVOL is we look at the interest rate markets. That to me seems like a very simple way of saying, where do lenders lend money, right? The different levels of interest rates around the world. And we use the over-the-counter swaps market, which is, there are lots of different rates in the US dollar. Fed funds is one, you have LIBOR, you have treasury rates. The OTC swaps market is where global bond issuers, right? When AstraZeneca needs to raise money, or when Sony needs to raise money, or any issuer around the world, any corporate, they hedge their bond risks in the rates market.
Thank you so much for a Wall Street Week Roundtable, Laird Landman from TCW and Nancy Davis from Quadratic Capital. Coming up, how the economy looks from the top of one of America's leading banks. We talk with Brian Moynihan of Bank of America.
Consumers in good shape, but by and large, a big portion of the economy is up and operating very well.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
Asia is absolutely core to our business. It's almost 20% of our franchise revenues globally, which is significantly more than most of our global peers who are more in the mid-teens.
People invest globally in China, but also we are also investing in the rest of Asia as well. Our top line growth for the region has been close to 24% last year, almost 20% of the group's revenue as a percentage of the revenue of the group. So, and this is where the group is counting on the growth.
We see company after company, these are corporates committing to net zero. So pretty much across the board, there is an enthusiasm for putting capital to work to try to get us to a better carbon future.
Credit Suisse has a fantastic brand name in Asia. We have obviously strong positions in Singapore and Hong Kong as our two main hubs, but across the region.
Countries that entered this crisis with limited fiscal space, with more vulnerabilities, need to be supported for the benefit of the world.
The transparency of the debt burden for the poorest countries needs to be increased. There needs to be fuller disclosure.
The Federal Reserve can put money into the system by increasing the money supply, but if banks aren't willing to lend it to corporations because they're afraid of bad loans and risky loans and write-offs, then the private economy will suffer.
That was PIMCO's Bill Gross on Wall Street Week back in 1990. This week, bank lending was back in the news again as the banks posted eye-popping numbers despite sluggish loan growth. As in 1990, the Federal Reserve has done its part in putting money into the system, but this time it's not because the banks are reluctant to lend. No, this time it's that the government's given a lot of money to households that have used it to pay off debt, leaving less reason to borrow. We talked with the head of one of the biggest lenders in the country. He's Brian Moynihan of Bank of America, and we asked him what this says about the economy going forward.
A big part of the economy, and I think our prediction is that for the economy to cross over the next couple of quarters to be bigger than it was before the pandemic is open and operating, and the consumers are spending money, and that's very good news. And then when you translate to Bank of America, what you're seeing is our deposits are way up because that money went into people's accounts and it's sitting there. But our loans are not as fell largely because people are paying us off because they have so much cash sitting around. So now the commercial side, we expect that to change. The economy growing at 7%, which is what we predict will require companies to borrow to service that economy. It's just that companies had a lot of cash too. So we look for more loan growth as the year progresses. But the good news is the consumer's in good shape. There's an unemployment issue. We got to get that the rest of the way down to where it should be. The businesses got to get open. It couldn't be. But by and large, a big portion of the economy is up and operating very well.
Bank of America has a very special viewpoint into the American economy because you have such a consumer, such a retail presence, and also the middle market. You really deal with small and medium-sized enterprises across the country. Are you seeing any pickup in the borrowing from your medium-sized companies yet?
We've seen it bump along the bottom. Usage of our business banking segment, which is 50 million and under revenue companies, and our middle market, which is 2.5 billion. We're seeing the line usage pretty flat. But the good news is it quit going down. We saw in the months during the quarter, January, February, March, it got a little stronger. Our origination activity, meaning new clients and new deals done, is strong, bodes well for the year. But we got to see it come through, and that goes back to those companies having a lot of cash and had to run very efficiently during the crisis because you didn't know what happened next. And now they're going to need to start spending money on supplies and things to redo their inventory. Now, the one thing I think we all have to be mindful is we got to get the trade. The trade is growing fast into the country, but the ports and things still need to get straightened out because of just the dynamics of the virus, and the supply chains are still ironing out. So I think one of the things I worry about for mid-sized companies, can they get the supplies to do what they do? So you've heard about lumber prices or resin and things like that. I think it'll straighten out. We hope it'll straighten out. But that's the next sort of outside the healthcare, the next challenge to get the supply chains really up and oiled and greased and running through to serve that fast-growing economy.
So if that is the consumer and the retail side, talk about the investment bank, the other side of your business here. You put up some very big numbers this morning. Can you make up for any shortfall on the retail side from what you're doing in investment banking? And what are you doing to do that?
Well, the investment banking fees year over year were 50% or something like that, $2 billion plus, terrific. The trading group had, under Jimmy DeMara's leadership, working for Tom Montag, had $5 billion plus of revenue. Matthew Coder in the investment banking side had a great quarter. The activity still seems to be strong in terms of the investment bank, and hopefully that bodes well, carries into the second quarter. Trading always settles down as you go through the year. It's just the works, but there's enough activity. So, those made up for it. Now the question is, now you'll see more roll through from the other sides of the house because they had to put up big provisions last year because of the worry about credit. That's gone, and they're taking credits back, and that the deposit base grew, and we can put it to work and finally earn some money. So as the investment bank activity could stay strong because lots of M&A activity has to take place. But if the markets settle down a little bit, that's fine because they've had such a great year. The other parts will roll through and make up for it. But we made $8 billion on $23 billion in revenue, and that's not a bad quarter.
Let's talk about yields. The yields have been pushing up on fixed income, despite the fact that this week actually we had a downturn. Maybe a flip or not, but It's really important to Bank of America, given the way your business works, what the 10-year yield on this treasury is and what the yield curve is, the spread between the 2s and the 10s. What are you projecting for the rest of the year? Many people think the yields are just going to keep marching up.
Well, we're all projecting that, and so we're up over the 10-year got up to 170, plus, and now it's back to 155 today. One of the reasons why the bank, companies like ours, took it on the chin a little bit, but that's transient. It'll move back and forth, and there were some reasons for that happening today, I'm told, but we'll see what happens tomorrow. But the reality is, if the economic activity is picking up and prices are picking up, which you've seen, unemployment's going down, the yield curve will start to normalize. And you saw that start to happen as we came in out of last year, fourth quarter to the first quarter. That helps us because as the curve gets higher, we can make more money from the loans and other things we do. Now, what's really important to us, honestly, is short rates. And the question is, when the Fed raises rates, the market has it pretty well deferred. And they've been clear that they want to see the inflation levels that Chair Powell's talked about. They want to see the unemployment numbers, and they've been clear about that. The question is whether it will happen faster than they have in their projections, as that even they have projections at 6% plus for GDP growth this year. And so we'll see when those rates, but that's the quicker route to success for us, because we have all these no interest bearing deposits that instantaneously are worth more, but we don't have to do any more work.
So I was going to ask you about risks, actually, because right now it looks like things are going gangbusters for Bank of America and some of the other big banks. What do you look at as risk? Is one of the risks the possibility that, in fact, the Fed may have to move sooner than the markets think? Because there are some people who are saying that they will.
Well, the question is, why do they have to move? They have to move because the growth is strong and they're comfortable. The inflation view will hold. Remember, they changed their monetary policy to do an average of inflation, and it's the first time we had the chance to put that to work. So I think if they're raising rates because the economy is strong and because the inflation outlook, everything is higher than their targets, that's not a bad thing. If they're raising because inflation and other things got out of control and wasn't temporary, that's probably not a good thing. So, the question of raising rates is a risk in certain circumstances and an extreme benefit in others, just because it means the economy is normalizing.
I want to ask one question about crypto, because it's come up quite a bit. I mean, you and I talked before about Bitcoin. You always say it's not Bitcoin, it's blockchain, it's distributed ledger. At the same time, we had the chairman of the Fed talk to us just this week and say, it's not cryptocurrency, crypto assets that you speculate about. How do you see the dynamic from Bitcoin on the one hand to cryptocurrency of any sort of the other, to perhaps a central bank digital currency? Where is this going?
Well, I think there are multiple facets. Obviously, as an asset people are investing in, our clients are asking us, can we invest in this asset and put it in our accounts and look at it? And those are issues we have to consider. And you're seeing some of our colleagues start to do formal custody. You've seen those announcements and things like that, which will enable us to do some things. And so that's the investment side, and that's for large institutions and affluent investors and people looking at it. Then you have the transactional side, and the question of moving money digitally is not new. More than, I think, probably 55-60% of our consumer money moved digitally this last quarter, and on the commercial side is probably 97%. It all moves digitally, very little paper movement. So the idea of moving money digitally, think about Zelle and the volumes going through that now, and the number of users, not only in our company, but in the industry total. That's not a new concept. Then the question is, an anonymous currency or currency that doesn't have attribution. That's a different question. And I think you've heard Chair Powell and Secretary of Treasuries in the past reflect on that. That's a different question. A central bank digital currency, is just, we already have. Anyway, we already have that. We have a bunch of accounts with them. They're ones and zeros. We know where they are. There's a huge amount of money represented by it. So the idea of making it available more granular, I think we'll see what they decide to do, and we'll react to it. But the reality is, we make money movement digitally is the dominant way money moves in our franchise today, and it will be in the future.
Brian, you've always prided yourself not only on being able to control costs, but also control risk, manage risk. You talk about responsible growth for Bank of America. We've had some instances in the recent past of some other banks that have raised questions about managing risk. I'm talking, of course, about Archegos. I understand from your chief financial officer that you weren't involved in that. But knowing you, when you first heard about that, did you ask Tom Montag, others, to say, do we have any exposure, not just to Archegos, not just to that one, but to other similar ones? How do you know that you don't have that kind of risk?
Well, that's a case, but every one of these cases, whether it's operational things that happen or or in that case, a lending arrangement, a prime brokerage type arrangement that goes awry. Whatever the case is, we don't think we have all the answers at all. We immediately say, could that have happened here? How do we know it didn't happen here? Let's go double check. Let's recheck all our systems, make sure, et cetera. Cybersecurity attack, whatever the case is. And so one of the ways you have to be curious. You have to ask a question. If you think, whether it's even on the competitive side, new products, new services, what's out there, what do customers need, you have to be curious, but also on the risk side. And Jeff Green, our chief risk officer, along with Tom and Jimmy DeMar and the team in the lending side, a fellow named Robert Schleicher and Bruce Thompson and Mick Anker, and these guys, this team and Cheryl Boucher, and this team is just very good at understanding risk. And so sometimes the opportunity is that you take it, sometimes you don't. But whenever anything happens, you've got to go in and look and say, okay, let's not act like we're too smart. Let's not think we're too smart. Let's have serious doubt about how good we are and go look at it and confirm that it didn't happen and says it couldn't have happened because. And that's the way you run good risk management.
Coming up, we'll have more with Brian Moynihan at Bank of America. A year ago, he sent tens of thousands of employees to work from home overnight. Now the question is, when will he bring them back, and does he need to?
We're a work from office company because of productivity and the culture and the mentoring that can take place. It's just better.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
Reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Model minority myth wasn't something that was fabricated by the Asian Americans. It was created as a tool to alienate the Black and the Asian American communities, and it was incredibly successful.
We know the racism didn't begin yesterday. We know it's probably not going to end tomorrow. But it is our job to make sure that there's progress and we keep people safe, give people dignity.
I spent a lot of time last year to just listen, to understand, to reflect, and understand what I could do as a leader of this organization.
For many years, we've been very shareholder focused, and now there really is much more of a community requirement.
The economic downturn in the US, we're seeing unemployment and income losses affecting women more than men.
2/3 of the jobs lost in South Africa were women's jobs. So I think we're in a moment of crisis.
Clearly, our societies are reproducing, not producing inequality.
We need better public policy and we need companies to step up.
I think what we see during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad, that we are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. Bank of America had to switch nearly all of its operations to work from home overnight when the pandemic struck a year ago. It managed it, but at a cost, both financial and interpersonal. Now the question is, when will it be time to bring them back? And do all of them need to return to the office? We return to our conversation with Bank of America Chairman and CEO, Brian Moynihan.
Our teammates want to work, and we're a work from office company because of productivity and the culture and the mentoring that can take place is just better. Now, maybe that changes over another couple of decades. Maybe if we were in this condition for a decade, we'd have to adjust. But in the end of the day, we already saying to people, you got to get, you get your vaccines. We get half the people in the office vaccinated. You can open the office, and we're having people trying to get through that window, in some of the field office and stuff. So we're letting people just make their decisions. We're encouraging them. We're showing them lots of data. We're trying to get appointments for our team and things like that so they can get back to work. And then we're a work from office company. Now, we're already in the mode of high performing places in sort of hoteling office and all the different discussion. We think people will think about commuting differently. I always tell the story that we had, our big buildings in Midtown at One Bryant Park, and we're doing a building across the street. And when we ask people to move to Jersey City or something like that, they might, or Hopewell, they might think, oh my gosh, you're sending me to Outer Mongolia or something like that. The reality is they now have gone from home and they're much more adaptable. Well, I'll commute in the city a couple of days, I'll commute, to Jersey City, or I'll go to Hopewell. So we have to think about our real estate configuration and retool it. In the end of the day, 10 years ago, we had 130 million square feet of real estate for Bank of America. Today, we have about 70. And so we can just keep making that real estate more efficient and more dedicated team, better real estate for our teammates to work in, and then work with them on their personal decisions. But at the end of the day, we have found in our work from office strategies, or work from home strategies, which we've had for years, that certain types of jobs and certain types of activity are better served. And we had about 20,000 people working from home before the pandemic, but it has to be a certain type of job and a certain activity, and we'll see how that plays out. But my big expectations after Labor Day, we'll be back to generally moving towards being back to normal. Between now and then, it'll be partial. But the key is then you flip it for the good of cities and towns and stuff. We as those people who are vaccinated come back to work and go to restaurants, that'll just be good for the vibrancy of downtown. So in Charlotte, I was talking to another CEO, we need to get the people commuting downtown, and then the restaurants and downtown life can come back, and great cities need that.
You've got a lot of real estate in Boston and in New York and in Charlotte. Are you going to have more in Florida? Because we're seeing a fair number of financial institutions that are moving south. Is that on the table for Bank of America?
Not really. We would, our operations are pretty well sited where they are. And by the way, we have a lot of people in Florida and a lot of people in Jacksonville and places like that, the big operation centers for years.
Brian, just one quick one here at the end, if you can. Was it hard to decide to sign on to that level about the Georgia voting law? Because you signed with a lot of other companies protesting what's going on.
Yeah, and our teammates and our customers, our teammates and others are saying, wait a second, we think this is something we have to make it clear that we stand for the principles of a right to vote, and we shouldn't infringe upon that. And that's a statement that was from the weekend or earlier this week. And, look at the list of people, those are people that fall on all different, political sides and things like that. This is about what America's all about.
That was Brian Moynihan, Chairman and CEO of Bank of America. Coming up, dealing with high tech. One problem that the United States and China have in common. And former IBM CEO Sam Palmisano sees the differences and the similarities.
If you are operating in China, you need to maintain a close relationship and partnership with the government.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
Every Friday with 30 minutes dedicated to fixed income, I'm Jonathan Ferro. This is Bloomberg Real Yield.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit Search Go to find answers now.
I'm David Weston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. Big Brother is going after Jack Ma's tech empire. As part of a string of crackdowns, Beijing imposed a record $2.8 billion fine on Alibaba for abusing its market dominance and ordered it to stop making merchants choose between Alibaba and competing platforms.
With this penalty decision, we received good guidance on some of the specific issues under the anti-monopoly law.
China also ordered an overhaul of Ant Group, which has expanded into payments, banking, wealth management, and insurance over the years.
I don't think the government wants this story to dominate through 2021. And specifically, they've been guiding media to report on how the government is pro what they call platform economy. They are pro the innovation.
The revamp leaves Ant's main businesses intact, but the new directive makes it harder for the firm to direct traffic from its payment service, Alipay, which has 1 billion users, to other Ant financial services, including wealth management, consumer lending, and even on-demand neighborhood services and delivery.
Our philosophy is simple. We carry out similar activities, similar risks as a bank, then you're subject to similar rules and similar requirements.
This week, Chinese regulators also summoned 34 of the country's largest tech companies, from Tencent to TikTok owner ByteDance, warning them to curb their excesses, joining a global rush by governments to regulate big tech.
Globally, the trend is that regulators will be more keen to look at some of the areas where you could have unfair competition.
Sam Palmisano knows what it is to run a tech giant the government wants to regulate. From his time as CEO of IBM, when the US government and the European Commission were both pursuing IBM. We asked him to evaluate the Chinese moves to restrict big tech and how they compare with US efforts.
Let's get back in the early stages of technology or in emerging economic opportunities, if we do it broadly. Governments always try to provide incentives or a clearer path for companies. And that started really in fintech in China. And basically, I was over there a lot when I was working. And it was clear from the central banking system that they wanted to be able to get more liquidity going to small businesses. And the state-owned enterprise banks are really focused on mid-sized to large companies. So they gave a lot of flexibility in the regulations to let these guys get going. And they did a phenomenal job. They get really big. And once they get really big, the government decides that we need to bring them back into the banking system and therefore create a holding company and subject them to more regulation.
At the same time, it really struck me that after there was that record fine imposed against Alibaba, Alibaba thanked the regulators for the fine. I don't remember IBM back in your day thanking the federal government for suing them.
Well, we as I used to say when I was a CEO, I'm elected every year by the shareholders. So it's a different system, here versus there. But I really mean, I could see that why, if you are operating in China, you need to maintain a close relationship and partnership with the government, because they can impact your business either positively and negatively in a very direct way, in a very quick and direct way.
Does that suggest that China may have an easier time, if you can call it easy, really getting their control over the big tech companies in China because of that different relationship than, for example, Washington would have with the big tech here in the United States?
You think about it, it's not a split government in any way. It's a centralized government in complete control. So if Xi Jinping decides he wants to stop IPO, he just stops the IPO there, right? They don't have to go through the process. There's not checks and balances and those sorts of things. So therefore, the government does have a lot of control. And in a lot of the early stage companies, I should say, governments are actually active shareholders in those companies. And over time they divest and sometimes they don't. An example would be Lenovo, what we did with selling the PC business at Lenovo. But at the early stage of that relationship, the Chinese government had about 25% share of Lenovo. Now they divested over time, but nonetheless, they come in and out of companies.
At the same time, President Xi has made it very clear he wants to compete on the world stage when it comes to tech. He's made that a priority of his. Does he have to be somewhat concerned about going too far in really curtailing big tech in China because it won't be as competitive with, for example, the United States?
The key to needs innovation, right? And there's a lot of the areas that they don't have the same expertise and experience in. Take entrepreneurship. I mean, there are a lot of great entrepreneurs in China, but not necessarily in tech in China. So therefore, there's going to be a encouragement, I believe, by the Chinese government for foreign investment in entrepreneurial endeavors. Even though in other places they're trying to control foreign investment. So you'll see this sort of almost like it's a split perspective or split interactions. Some areas are going to say they want indigenous innovation, but they need foreign help. And that's how they'll pursue it, in my opinion. Look at Hong Kong, for example. They're getting more control of Hong Kong, but they're putting tax incentives to attract hedge funds and wealthy people to Hong Kong. So you would say, aren't they counter interests in each other, the communist system of socialism, or is it attracting hedge funds and large wealthy people? Well, they're very pragmatic, and depending upon their goals, they will adjust.
The other big issue this week when it comes to tech was supply chains. As we saw this virtual meeting at the White House, President Biden himself appeared for a time. There's a big chip shortage right now the United States is suffering from. What is the right answer on supply chain, and how different is the U.S. situation on supply chains from that in China?
Well, they're quite different. But basically, there's a worldwide constraint at this point in time over chips. It's driven by some factors, pandemic clearly being one of them, demand shifts being the other. There's been much more movement into traditional IT PCs at home than there would have been without a pandemic, as students learning in the house, entertaining in the house, et cetera, et cetera. So those two things combined cause a big demand shift, which the industry's missed. But the industry on the manufacturing side, which are called fabs, fabricators, is very concentrated. There are 2 or 3 big players, and most of them are in Asia. In Taiwan, in Korea, they're in Asia. Right? There's still some in the United States. There's very few in Europe, but they're predominantly in Asia, those big companies. So having said all that, right, you have an issue of concentration as a supply problem, which the companies are going to have to address, right? Which is basically how they create alternative sources of supply so they don't run into these situations again. And they might create their own little fabs, they might form consortiums. That'll all be adjusted. It is going to take time to get through this because fabs are very capital intensive. Having said that, a government's going to have a different view of this. The government's going to view, hey, strategically, I need to get control over this manufacturing capability. I need to bring it back home. It's almost like strategic oil reserves, if I can make that analogy. They're going to have a core group of these kinds of companies housed within their domicile in their countries so they can keep control of a secure supply chain, especially when it comes to national security.
What about China with respect to microchip supply? Do they have a similar problem constraint in being able to get access to microchips?
It's more complicated. It's not just access, it's the technology. Right now, China, their semiconductor infrastructure is about 2 generations behind the current infrastructure. That can be appropriate for a lot of use cases, vehicles and those sorts of things. It's not appropriate for really pushing the edge of technology, what they would want to push for national defense. Networks, high-speed networks, 5G, visual recognition, those sorts of things, right? That's the latest technology. They're behind. So there are challenges too. One is, how do I get it on shore? And the other is, how do I get these strategic technologies, or how do I learn quickly enough to catch up to the rest of the world? They're investing vast amounts of money to do those things. I think it's what's picked up in there. But I think they're investing vast amounts of money into those companies to create that infrastructure. They've been at it for a long time, by the way, and this is not new. It just takes a long time to catch up because technology keeps moving forward.
That was Wall Street Week contributor Sam Palmisano. Coming up, we take a look at the week ahead on Global Wall Street. This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. It's time now to take a look at the week ahead on Global Wall Street.
Thanks, David. Well, after the record China GDP numbers, we'll get a clearer read on the country's consumer-led rebound and green push when China's biggest car show opens its doors in Shanghai. Meanwhile, over in Hainan at the annual Bao Forum, we'll hear from world leaders and central bankers such as the PBOC Governor Yi Gang, the IMF's Kristalina Georgieva, and AIIB President Jin Liqiang. We're also focused on the reopening story, and we'll have the much-anticipated TRIP IPO in Hong Kong. While on Monday, Australia and New Zealand open up their borders in what's believed to be the first travel bubble of its kind. We'll also see if gamers are heading back to Macau when March visitor arrivals are released Thursday. Danny?
Thanks, Juliet. We have the ECB decision this coming Thursday, where we're expecting policymakers to sound cautiously optimistic, especially as Europe races to vaccinate the population. With that in mind, any updates on the AstraZeneca and J&J vaccines where concerns about rare blood clots have been raised will be closely watched. Romain?
Thank you, Danny. Earnings season revving up here in the U.S. About 80 of the S&P 500 companies scheduled to report. That includes Coca-Cola and United Airlines on Monday, Netflix on Tuesday, Verizon and Chipotle on Wednesday, and then Intel, Honeywell, and American Express round out the week. On the economic front, we get the latest data for monthly home sales, as well as the PMI readings for the manufacturing and services industries. And two important meetings in Washington near the end of the week. President Joe Biden preparing to host 40 world leaders for a virtual summit on climate change, and a CDC advisory committee is set to reconvene to discuss the safety of the J&J COVID vaccine shot. David?
Thanks to Juliet, Danny, and Romain. Coming up, we wrap up the week with special Wall Street Week contributor Larry Summers of Harvard. This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
It wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical potential rising.
Asia is absolutely core to our business. It's almost 20% of our franchise revenues globally, which is significantly more than most of our global peers who are more in the mid-teens.
We will invest globally in China, but also we are also investing in the rest of Asia as well. Our top line growth for the region has been close to 24% last year, almost 20% of the group's revenue as a percentage of the revenue of the group. So, and this is where the group is counting on the growth.
We see company after company, these are corporates committing to net zero. So pretty much across the board, there is an enthusiasm for putting capital to work to try to get us to a better carbon future.
Credit Suisse has a fantastic brand name in Asia. We have obviously strong positions in Singapore and Hong Kong as our two main hubs, but across the region.
Valuations, particularly sort of technology landscape, have gotten to some pretty extraordinary levels. So I think it's not a surprise. I don't think it's any indication of the beginning of the end, but I do think markets don't like uncertainty.
This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. And as we do every week, we're going to wrap up the week with our special contributor. He is Larry Summers of Harvard. Larry, welcome back. Great to have you here. Let's talk about inflation. We've talked about it on this program. We've talked about it elsewhere quite a few times. But this week we have the Council of Economic Advisors put out a blog post, a fairly long essay that I'm not sure, but I think it might have been responding to you. They think we don't have a long-term problem. What do you say?
I read the CEA analysis pretty carefully. I can't say it put my mind at ease. here are some things it didn't talk about. Didn't talk about the housing market on fire more than any time since the statistics were being created. Didn't talk about all the employers who reported that they were having difficulty finding labor, or the fact that the vacancy rate is already back to normal levels. Didn't talk about the purchasing manager surveys, which show things to be in unprecedented territory. Didn't talk about the largest one-quarter movement upwards in 10-year bond yields in decades. It didn't talk about the consequences for inflation psychology of a change in the policy regime away from preempting inflation towards preempting the idea of doing something about inflation. It argued that there was going to be a variety of transient factors that would lead to high inflation now. It's right about that, but that's a little bit like arguing that we're about to have a blizzard, but that doesn't mean anybody should worry about how bad the winter is going to be. So there are no certainties, and God knows economists aren't very good at forecasting inflation. But if you look at the overheating economy theory of inflation, looks like we're headed towards an overheating economy. If you look at the monetarist theory of inflation, money aggregates are growing at unprecedented rates. If you look at the fiscal theory of inflation, we're in an unprecedented fiscal experiment. So it certainly didn't convince me that one should be relaxed about inflation. And David, I have to say that the frequency with which people return to this argument and debate suggests to me that there is a certain amount of discomfort and concern out there, but we'll see what happens. And I don't think we'll know for 18 months or so what the consequences of the experiment we're engaged in are. But so far, nothing's happened that has given me any reassurance. And if anything, the flow of the numbers has been more rapid than I would have expected, and more cause for concern.
Yeah, it certainly looks like you've hit a sore spot there. There's a lot of reaction to what you had to say. At the same time, we also hear from Federal Reserve officials, including Jay Powell, the chairman, and he keeps coming back to a point that they do make in the Council of Economic Advisors essay, which is there are long-term, at least decade-long forces that are large headwinds against inflation. Those include an aging population, they include technology, they include globalization. Will that keep us away from an unmoored inflation?
Maybe, but those kinds of structural forces have more to do with the level of prices than they do with the rate of inflation. It's the basic law of economics that when things are in short supply, they tend to go up in price, and to go up in price more rapidly the shorter the supply is. And if you look at it, whether it's houses or silicon chips or restaurant workers or skilled managers, there are more and more things headed for very short supply. And I think that's going to make their prices and wages go up. And I don't see why Jay's structural factors change that basic logic. It may take a little longer. The timing may be a little bit different. But, you know, for the first time, David, since they started collecting the statistics, a majority of American homes that sell are selling above the asking price. That's got to be telling you that asking prices are about to soar. Now, we use a price index that doesn't pay attention to the price of houses in calculating the price of living in owner-occupied housing, believe it or not. We've got some formula involving something called owner's equivalent rental. But from a common sense point of view, The idea that housing is dragging down inflation surely must seem absurd to most Americans, and it can't be the way it's going to be for a very long time, given what we're seeing.
Well, let's talk about growth. We've long heard about how delightful it is to have global synchronized growth. Right now, it doesn't look like we're heading there. We have asynchronous growth. We certainly have China doing quite well. The United States apparently is headed, at least for a year or so, into pretty robust growth. On the other hand, Europe seems to be lagging behind, and then don't even get me started about some of the emerging markets. They seem to be really suffering quite a bit. What are the risks in that kind of asymmetry in the global economy?
You know, to paraphrase Dickens, we may be headed for a tale of two worlds between the U.S. and China on the one hand, and large parts of the developing world on the other. I heard a debate the other day, and it's the most depressing debate I've heard in a long time, about whether when you look at Latin America and Africa and even parts of India, you're going to be looking at a lost decade or you're going to be looking at a lost generation. We just have not seen remotely the kind of boldness and imagination that we've seen in responding to this with monetary and fiscal policy for the rich countries like the United States in some of the poorest countries. And to have that kind of effort requires the international system to step up. And so far, it's really stepped up in a rather inadequate way. I think this is going to have huge political consequences for our security, not to mention the tragic consequences for millions, if not 10 millions of people.
At the same time, I can hear in my head some people up on Capitol Hill, I will say they tend to be Republicans, maybe not exclusively, who say, why is that our problem? You heard that in some of the exchanges with Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, actually, over the SDR, the special drawing rights contest about the IMF, which basically, why are we helping out the rest of the world?
This is not a charitable endeavor. This is forward defense of our global interests. And look, I'm as worried as anybody about China. I'm as worried about anybody as Russia. But frankly, over the next decade, I think we've got more to fear from microbes than we do from Xi Jinping.
So let's wrap up this week with a lightning round here, as Summer says. Number one, let me ask you, do you think that we'll have a 10-year yield at 3% before we get down to 4% on the unemployment number?
It's a race. My guess is we'll get to the 4% unemployment rate first, because we'll get to it this year.
And secondly, there's a lot of talk about inequality, income and wealth inequality in this country. It's been great and growing for some time. A lot of people say we have to fix it, including Jay Powell at the Federal Reserve. If you're going to really address that issue, can you do it through fiscal policy or other means, or do you need labor law reform, such as President Biden is trying to implement?
I hesitate ever to use the word need, but I'll say this: we sure could use labor law reform in this country. I think it's something where we Democrats have not been aggressive enough for a long time. The impunity with which employers can break up union organizing efforts and fire union organizers with only a slap on the wrist is a national embarrassment, and it is something that should be changed very quickly.
And finally, Larry, you, of course, were Secretary of Treasury. Toward the end of the week on Thursday, we heard the United States government are going to impose new sanctions on Russia for that solar wind hack, as well as for interference in the election. And part of the sanctions were really specifically on Russian sovereign debt. From your experience, is that a gesture, or could it actually change Russian behavior? How effective is that sort of sanction?
I think it has some impact, but it's easier to be critical of sanctions than it is to identify an alternative. When countries do things that are sufficiently wrong from our viewpoint, and we want to do more than talk, and God knows we don't want to do anything violent, there's a tendency for policy to go to sanctions, and it's probably the best of bad alternatives.
Okay, thank you so very much to our Wall Street Week special contributor, Larry Summers of Harvard University. Finally, one more thought. Bernie Madoff. This week, Wall Street lost one of its most infamous villains. We all know the story, the man who spent decades building an investment fund that didn't invest, who told his 4,800 investors they were worth $65 billion that wasn't there, who took advantage of the rich and the famous and the not so rich and the not so famous, his close friends, and even the endowment of the Orthodox University whose board he chaired. This week, Bernie Madoff died in prison, like Charles Ponzi did 70 years ago, the man who gave his name to the scheme Madoff copied and then took to a scale no one could have imagined.
This was a multi-decade Ponzi scheme, which was unusual in its, he never bought a single share of stock. He never bought any options.
When something as big and as bad as Bernie Madoff's crime happens, we all look for some larger meaning. Does it show us that we're all gullible, that we're all greedy, that we are all too willing to wish ourselves to success, even when it's too good to be true? Does it tell us that no matter how much we may regulate, we can never regulate our way to integrity? Or maybe, just maybe, it's an important reminder that there are some people who are out there who, and there is no other word for it, have evil in their heart. But they're rare, and the willingness of the rest of us to trust, despite knowing they are out there, is what makes it all work in the end, isn't it? That does it for this episode of Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. This is Bloomberg. See you next week.
$1.4 trillion of cash, one of the most notable aspects of this report that was stellar.
We're early on in this year. I know we've already sort of penciled in 6 or 7% growth and a big fall in unemployment, but under outcome-based policy, we really want to see that.
I'm bullish on the rebound, but I know we have a long way to go before the job is complete.
There's no textbook for this. You don't want to be too preemptive, but I also don't want to be so reactive that we're late.
I think it's too early to talk about changing monetary policy while we're still in the pandemic tunnel.
In the fight against COVID-19 worldwide, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has committed a staggering $1.75 billion to vaccine development, distribution, treatments, and more. It's one of the largest sums from any philanthropic effort around the globe. But while mass vaccinations are rapidly underway, the pandemic is far from over.
There is a clear problem that low and most middle-income countries are not receiving the vaccine yet.
Urgent concerns about unequal distribution and recovery remain, and the possibility that not just developing countries, but women across the globe will get left behind. Joining me on this edition of Bloomberg Studio 1.0 to shine a light on the uneven road ahead, co-founder and co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Melinda Gates. Melinda, it's been a year since the pandemic completely changed our world. From your perspective, where are we right now in the fight against COVID?
Well, I think we still have a ways to go. We're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel here in the United States, but until all Americans are vaccinated, we still have a ways to go. But it's going to be a while until the entire world is vaccinated. So this is going to still be with us the next few years. And I think we're going to have to really watch these variants that'll be bouncing around the world. That's actually still quite concerning.
What is it about the variants that concern you?
Well, because every time we know viruses mutate, but when they mutate, they can become sometimes more deadly or more contagious. And so anytime you see these mutations, we need to be on top of them in terms of surveillance. And then we're going to have to figure out, do we need to tune various vaccines to take care of them?
So your foundation has committed $1.75 billion to the fight against COVID. I know your team is very diligent about looking at where and how that money is spent. In your view, where is the vaccine rollout working and what's not working?
Well, I think it's working in some of our high-income countries. We're starting to finally see, much broader distribution, for instance, in the United States and in some of the European countries, but it is not at all working yet for middle and low-income countries. And those are places where people are struggling. They have their loved ones who get ill. They can't get them to a hospital, much less an ICU. And so they are really still struggling in many countries around the world.
So there's obviously a moral case for vaccine equity, but what about the economic case? Why should somebody in New York or San Francisco care when somebody in Africa gets the vaccine?
Well, absolutely, it's the right moral thing to do. But economically, we're not going to have as swift a recovery in the United States or in Europe if we don't make sure that everybody gets vaccinated. Because what will happen is this disease, we know it crosses borders. We've seen it all over the world. And so as these variants break out, they will absolutely come back into the United States and Europe and Japan. And so our supply chains won't fully be up and running. We won't get our travel industry fully and leisure up and running, or the business community up and running in terms of travel. So economically, if we're going to reopen the global economy, we've got to take care of this everywhere.
So if vaccines aren't distributed equally, obviously there's economic consequences. There will also be more deaths. What are the consequences of that?
Well, more deaths, it's a tragedy for every family that experiences a loss. But it's also, I think we have to remember, it's wreaking havoc on the healthcare systems of these countries. And so what it means is a mom who is pregnant doesn't go in for her antenatal visits. She doesn't go in for delivery. So she has an unsafe delivery at home. It means we have 49 million women that won't get contraceptives during this pandemic. That means 15 million unplanned pregnancies in 1 year. That's like adding up the cities of Chicago, New York, and LA and saying we're going to have 15 million unplanned pregnancies. Wow.
Vaccine nationalism is stepping up as this continues. You've got nations competing for supplies. Do you see a better way?
Well, I think, we started off as a world with a good way, which is to try and pool both the demand and match it to what would be the supply and to have financing for that. The US didn't come into that financing until the last stimulus bill that happened in December. They finally put money forward for Gavi, which helps with this facility called COVAX to purchase vaccines and get it organized. We just now are coming in with this latest stimulus bill for testing and treatment. But that would have been the way to go, is to really match global demand and supply and first get it out to all the healthcare workers all over the world before you even begin then going to vulnerable populations.
Anytime there's continued disinformation about vaccines, how do you and Bill see that kind of misinformation?
Yeah, when you see it, I will say it's incredibly disheartening because honestly, it causes death. People not doing the right thing, not getting their mom or their elderly father vaccinated. We'll lose more people. We are losing more people. So it's disheartening. On the other hand, as more people are getting vaccinated, just take the United States, we're seeing more demand for vaccines. So we're finally seeing the counter-cyclical part of that argument, but it's always disheartening to see something like that.
Now, a huge part of your job before the pandemic was traveling around the world, meeting people, talking to them in person in far-flung places that most of us don't get to go. How has your job changed during COVID now that you can't make those trips?
Well, I think like so many others who are lucky enough to be able to have access to a computer and a good internet, right? I'm doing a lot of meetings online, and they are pretty continuous throughout the day. I am certainly meeting with still leaders around the world, even community organizers around the world. But I miss the, deep connection and interaction with women in her home, or a man who's working in his field, or the children. I miss that, and so I look forward to when that will return, hopefully in the next year.
What are some tangible things that you would like to see from the White House that would really make a difference for women?
I would love to see an innovation fund focused on childcare.
Model minority myth wasn't something that was fabricated by the Asian Americans. It was created as a tool to alienate the Black and the Asian American communities, and it was incredibly successful.
We know the racism didn't begin yesterday. We know it's probably not going to end tomorrow, but it is our job to make sure that there's progress and we keep people safe, give people dignity.
I spent a lot of time last year to just listen, to understand, to reflect, and understand what I could do as a leader of this organization.
For many years, we've been very shareholder focused, and now there really is much more of a community requirement.
The economic downturn in the US, we're seeing unemployment and income losses affecting women more than men.
2/3 of the jobs lost in South Africa were women's jobs. So I think we're in a moment of crisis.
Clearly, our societies are reproducing, not producing inequality.
We need better public policy, and we need companies to step up.
In your annual letter, you and Bill said the recovery starts with women. What do you mean by that?
Well, women have had the most devastation. Women and people of color took this crisis. We know women have left the labor force in droves. We know they're at home with this complete caregiving crisis, taking care of the young, taking care of the elderly. And so if we're going to have a full response and a swift response, we have to stop thinking as a world of gender equality as this nice thing to do when we get to it, or this side issue. No, it is the central issue. If we're going to get a full recovery and a swift recovery, we've got to address all of the issues that are facing women. We are in a crisis for women and people of color in this country.
Now, the last time you and I spoke, it was about your book, The Moment of Lift, How Empowering Women Changes the World. That came out 2 years ago on the heels of Me Too. There was a lot of hope. Have you seen that play out, or have you seen progress derailed?
We've seen, I would definitely say that was a moment of optimism for me. And I would say now I think women are in a moment of crisis. So we've seen a lot of work derailed. We've seen women women in the last 30 years were coming out of poverty as a globe, and now we're seeing a huge setback in that arena. we're seeing setback in the labor force. The number of women who've stepped back from the labor force in the United States, 2/3 of the jobs lost in South Africa were women's jobs. So I think we're in a moment of crisis. But then on the flip side, I see these female leaders, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, Prime Minister Merkel, how well their countries are doing. Or I see these self-help groups in India that immediately mobilized and got messages about COVID out to millions of people in northern India. So I see the hope on the other side, but there's a lot of work to do.
I was planning to ask you about New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern and Germany's Angela Merkel. Do you think it's a coincidence that both of these leaders, who seem to have handled the pandemic better than any other leader around the world, do you think it's a coincidence that they're both women?
Not at all. I spoke with both of them pretty early in the crisis, but where New Zealand had just taken care of COVID in their country the first time, and Prime Minister Merkel had it under control in Germany. And I was also speaking to male leaders at the same time. But what I noticed when I talked to these two women a month apart is that Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern was thinking about all the island nations around her, and that they were struggling. And so, yes, they had it under control in New Zealand, but she was thinking about the whole ecosystem around them and everybody else. Prime Minister Merkel, when I talked with her about, wow, you all are doing an amazing job, she wanted to talk about the marginalized communities in Germany they weren't yet reaching. And she wanted to talk about how they were taking patients in from other countries into their emergency room and ICU. So they're thinking about everybody else. And I see that sometimes in enlightened male leaders, but I think for the women, it just comes really naturally.
So how does that compare with your early conversations with the Trump administration as you were working with the US government to deploy your own resources?
Well, I think, there were certain people who are still in place who are absolutely incredible. Tony Fauci from the get-go, just an amazing leader. Francis Collins at the NIH. But, to talk to an administration who doesn't believe in science and basically wants to put their blinders on in terms of what the response needs to be in the United States, it was incredibly frustrating. And I am very happy to see a new administration who's not only taking this seriously, but taking very bold and concrete actions. That's what we should expect as Americans.
So how have your conversations with the Biden administration been so far, now a few months into it? What are you happy about in terms of what you're seeing? What needs work?
I'm seeing the Biden administration absolutely listen to the science, listen to the scientists, believe in the data. You're seeing them re-empower CDC. CDC just came out with great guidelines for people who have been vaccinated. So they've taken these institutions that were strong and robust, and they're empowering them again. I was incredibly pleased to see the latest stimulus package pushed through and funded so swiftly for Americans. That's exactly the kind of action we need as Americans.
The Biden administration just signed an executive order on gender equity on International Women's Day. What are some other concrete, tangible things you would like to see from the White House that would really make a difference for women in this country?
Well, I'd love to see an innovation fund. In previous administrations, there have been these innovation funds that make sure we get new innovations, for instance, in climate change or in other sectors. I would love to see an innovation fund focused on childcare. We have a caregiving crisis, not just childcare, elderly care too. We have a caregiving crisis, and yet there are great ideas out there, solutions for how you match markets, you match caregivers, affordable, good, high-quality caregivers with parents, or you match grandparents with college kids so they can get their prescriptions. Those kinds of ideas need to be funded and come forward so that we can come up with new innovations in society.
When it comes to women and how much they've backslid in the pandemic, do you think we could see a lost generation of women as a result of the trauma that they have experienced in the last year?
I think we could, but I don't think it's necessary or a necessity. And I think, one of the things the Biden administration is talking about is paid family medical leave. We are the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't have it. And it's far from time we had it. And so I think we can take this crisis that's happened to women. Women are in crisis at home. They are carrying a lot. But we can use it to say, we're not just going to propel these women and help them back in the workforce. We're going to change the structure of the workforce for the next 30 years. So we make it possible for moms and dads or like-minded partners to work. We're going to look at this as a forward-looking workforce, not a 1950s workforce where our dads went to work and our moms stayed home.
Well, and speaking of how the workforce will change going forward, I believe we're going to be in a more hybrid environment in the future, more flexible work, more people working from home. And I wonder if we're going to continue to see women in this difficult situation. Like, how do you see the new normal for women being different than the new normal for men? And what should we be concerned about and preparing for?
I think we need to make sure that women aren't expected to now continue to care for the children and the elderly and keep their job going. They're in a crisis that can't continue. The toll on women is enormous. So I think we need to say, how are we going to make sure we support women? How do we bring them back into the workforce? How do we reskill them if they want to change jobs? How do we make sure they have access to good childcare, potentially even good universal preschool? And then how do we make sure as well that we're supporting them, that if they have a sick family member, there's not just maternity leave or sick maternity days, but there's paid family medical leave. So even the dad leaves the office to take the child to the pediatrician when the child gets sick, or takes care of the elderly grandparents.
I wonder if you think we're going to see the most meaningful change in the world coming from philanthropy.
Ultimately, it's always up to government to scale up innovations to create this change.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Mercedes-Benz is on a path towards CO2 neutral mobility. So we have flicked the switch there, and really we're going to step by step electrify everything. And what does that mean? Combustion engines get electrified.
When you wrote your book, you shared that you quit your own job at Microsoft because you assumed that you should stay home and take care of the kids. And then at a certain point, you decided you wanted to go back to work. What were your motivations there? And how would you encourage other women to summon their motivation?
I would say, you have to look at what you're doing and what your expectations are. And I think for me, it was always when I would hit these frustration points of, my gosh, why am I doing all of this and my husband is not? And so I think we all have to look at our homes and say, who's doing what? And how do we redistribute that workload? And we have to have those honest conversations with one another. One of the stories I tell in my book when I did want to go back to work was, Bill and I knew where we wanted to put our children in school, but it was far away from our house. And I thought, hey, we could make wanted them to start at preschool. And I just said, look, I can't be on the road driving all the time. I see my road ahead and my life ahead of the minute. And so he kindly offered to drive the kids to school. And it not only changed the norm in our family, and he got that time with the kids, but when he went into the classroom, other moms expected their husbands then to drive because they said, see how Microsoft is driving his kids to school? So can you. And it's those conversations at home when we see what's right there, we have awareness, we have the difficult conversation that we remodel norms inadvertently actually in society.
I'm curious about female leadership and if you think female leadership could suffer as a result of the pandemic. We need